It all begins when a young man bitterly regrets putting his trust in a swindler. With trembling hands, he hesitates to hold the pen, unsure whether he should sign the suspicious contract. Sitting in a cafe, he asks his friend if the investment is truly safe. His friend slams his hand on the table in frustration, telling him to stop overthinking and sign the papers already. The scammer quickly reassures him, insisting he would never cheat a former school friend. He promises the investment will bring enormous profits and claims he only shared the opportunity because he genuinely cares about him. The fake friend even brings up the day the young man had to answer work calls during his own father's funeral. He says it broke his heart to watch his old classmate humiliate himself for his boss. Hearing his late father being used as part of the manipulation fills the young man with anger, but he has no way to fight back. Left with no other choice, he signs the contract, hoping those words are sincere. Soon enough, he realizes he was nothing more than a fool for believing such an obvious lie. 2 years later, the story shifts to a dimly lit apartment, where the bathroom light reveals his miserable condition. The young man is kneeling in front of the toilet, violently vomiting everything in his stomach. Even the few snacks he had finally managed to afford at the age of 28 are gone. He realizes that his life in South Korea has completely fallen apart. The scammer vanished a year earlier, leaving him buried under an overwhelming mountain of debt. With only a few hours remaining before his next work shift, he picks up a book to ease his exhausted mind. His only escape from this miserable life is reading his favorite novel, Dark Hitter. Having read it more than 100 times, he knows every page by heart. Reading is the only thing that allows him to forget his painful reality, even if only for a little while. Suddenly, he senses something unusual in the air and looks away from the book. Confused, he glances out the window and notices several glowing purple feathers drifting silently across the night sky. Fascinated, he wonders if they are crow feathers shining in the darkness. Without warning, he begins coughing violently before spitting out a horrifying amount of blood. It pours from his mouth, completely staining the cover of the novel he treasures so much. An unbearable pain erupts in his chest, as though his heart is burning from within and about to burst. Struggling to breathe, he collapses onto the floor as mysterious purple smoke begins flowing out of the strange book. His face covered in blood, the young man curses his miserable life for ending in such a tragic way. Barely able to move, he falls onto the bed and wonders if this truly is the meaningless end of his life. The moment he accepts death, an intense heat begins boiling inside his body. Filled with resentment, he realizes the last face he can remember before dying is that of the con artist who ruined his life. Unable to resist, he simply watches black feathers drifting around him as his consciousness slowly fades away. A mysterious message suddenly appears in the darkness, announcing the completion of a mission and the unlocking of a special skill. The young man jolts awake, his eyes glowing with a brilliant blue light as he gasps for air. He quickly sits up, wondering if everything that happened was nothing more than a terrible nightmare. Still dazed, he blinks repeatedly while trying to recover from the shock. Looking around, he realizes he is inside an unfamiliar yet incredibly luxurious room. Completely bewildered, he carefully examines every corner of the elegant place. Having no idea where he is, a sudden sound grabs his attention, causing him to immediately turn toward the window. There, he comes face to face with a giant crow with glowing red eyes staring directly at him from outside. As he steps closer to the window, he is stunned to discover that the night sky is illuminated by 3 separate moons. At the same time, countless enormous crows flap their wings and circle excitedly around the massive structure. Dozens of enormous birds soar past the windows of the massive castle beneath the moonlit night sky. The young man stares at the stars, struggling to comprehend the unbelievable and terrifying scene before him. As he notices the 3 differently colored moons, he begins to suspect that he has somehow been transported into the novel he was reading. Catching his reflection in the window, he becomes completely certain that he is no longer in his original world. A voice calls from outside, addressing him as Prince Ian of Viren, and introduces herself as the maid, Anna. She politely asks for permission to enter, but the young man, overwhelmed with panic, tells her to wait because he is not feeling well. However, the door slowly begins to open anyway, making him even more desperate. A splitting headache suddenly overwhelms him, and before he can stop her from entering, he collapses onto the bedroom floor. Anna quietly says she will return later and leaves. Lying on the floor, the young man realizes his suspicions were completely correct. Clutching his head in pain, he pieces everything together and understands that he has been transported into the very novel he had read countless times. He discovers that he has reincarnated into the world of Dark Hitter, and now inhabits the body of the 7th prince, Ian Oberon. Despair immediately consumes him, as he remembers that this prince is destined to suffer a tragic and painful death near the beginning of the story. Sitting alone, he regrets awakening inside a novel, especially as a character whose fate has already been sealed. Moments later, a mysterious man wearing dark glasses enters the room and formally introduces himself as Sign. The young man is startled to realize that this cold and intimidating man is the prince's personal advisor. Sign walks in alongside a maid carrying a tray of food, explaining that he personally came because he was concerned about the prince's condition. Adjusting his glasses with a calculating smile, he asks whether the prince is feeling any better. The young man forces himself to remain calm and decides that his safest option is to pretend he is the real prince. He calmly replies that he is feeling much better, prompting Sign to act immediately relieved by the response. The advisor then rudely orders the frightened maid to serve the special meal prepared for His Royal Highness. Trembling with fear, she places the food on the table while the young man silently thinks it looks more like dog food than a royal meal. As he reaches for the teapot to pour himself some tea, he accidentally knocks the heavy pot over. Hot tea spills across the table within seconds, instantly filling the room with tension. The young maid's eyes widen in horror, as though she has just received a death sentence. She immediately falls to her knees, desperately begging for forgiveness, leaving the young man completely confused by her exaggerated reaction. Crying uncontrollably, she hurriedly wipes away the spilled tea while apologizing over and over again. Only then does the protagonist remember an important detail about the original owner of this body. The former, Ian Oberon, was an exceptionally cruel and sadistic prince who would beat or even kill his servants over the smallest mistakes. Breaking the silence, Sign politely apologizes for interrupting but says he is delighted to see the prince recovering so quickly. With a sly smile, he produces a scroll, clearly preparing to carry out his usual financial scam. He asks the prince to sign the budget proposal immediately, claiming it is an urgent matter. The young man instantly recognizes the lie and wonders why a prince who is considered worthless would suddenly have such an urgent financial document to approve. He already knows the paperwork is completely fraudulent and exists only to steal the funds allocated to the prince. Sign is able to abuse his authority because he is a distant relative of the Empress, the woman who rules the empire with an iron fist. The original prince would have signed any document without reading it, but the protagonist hesitates, wondering whether he should follow the novel's original storyline. Seeing his hesitation, Sign mocks him with a sarcastic smile, asking whether the prince has forgotten how to write his own name. Humiliated by the disrespect of a mere subordinate, the young man curses his fate for reincarnating into such a powerless character. The advisor continues pressuring him, repeatedly telling him to stop thinking and simply sign the document. Those words instantly awaken a painful memory from his previous life on Earth, when his so-called friend tricked him using the exact same line. The image of the scammer demanding his signature flashes through his mind like a warning. Biting his lip in frustration, he realizes this situation is almost identical to the one that cost him everything. At that moment, the young man makes a firm vow. He swears that he will never allow himself to be manipulated again. Instead of signing, he questions the advisor, pointing out that the expenses listed in the document are highly suspicious and that the proposed budget is nothing but a waste of money. Sign lets out a mocking laugh, pretending to be surprised that the prince is capable of performing such simple calculations. He pressures him once more, saying the food will grow cold and that he can review the document after signing it. The advisor repeats his demand in an increasingly authoritarian tone, but before he can continue, a loud crashing sound suddenly echoes through the room as something on the table shatters. The maid jumps in terror at the sudden crash and immediately backs away, fearing for her life. The young man had deliberately thrown the teapot onto the floor, shattering it along with the expensive pocket watch resting on the dining table. Facing the stunned and speechless advisor, the protagonist simply smiles and casually remarks that his hand slipped. He remembers that Sign is such a distant relative of the Empress that she does not even know he exists within the palace. With complete confidence, the young man leans back in his chair, adopting an authoritative posture that leaves the abusive advisor completely stunned. Sign is at a loss for words as he notices the intimidating look in the prince's eyes, so different from the timid and submissive person he had always known. The young man makes up his mind that he will never suffer the pathetic fate awaiting the prince in the novel. Instead, he blames the advisor for the mess. Having spent his previous life as someone who was constantly taken advantage of, he decides to use everything he knows about the story to change his own destiny. With a cold and commanding expression, the prince asks his subordinate why he is still standing there. Pointing toward the broken pieces scattered across the floor, he calmly states that the bedroom carpet has become dirty and orders the advisor to clean it immediately. He is prepared to do whatever it takes to survive in this ruthless world. After all, members of the imperial family are treated as living gods. Every treasure and luxury in the empire exists solely for their sake. According to legend, only those of royal blood possess extraordinary abilities, along with the iconic golden hair that symbolizes divine nobility. Sign scoffs inwardly, believing that every prince fits that description except the worthless seventh prince. He recalls how foolish and short-tempered the young man has always been, not to mention his black hair, which is considered disgraceful among the royal family. The advisor burns with resentment, realizing he spent a fortune on bribes only to end up serving such a hopeless prince. Swallowing his pride, Sign kneels before the prince and personally begins cleaning the broken pieces and spilled tea from the floor. Although furious about being forced into such a humiliating task, he quickly finishes and announces that everything has been cleaned. Just as the advisor prepares to leave, the prince deliberately drops another expensive porcelain cup onto the floor. Startled by the loud crash, Sign spins around in disbelief. The prince smirks and mockingly tells him to consider it extra training, his red eyes filled with a frightening intensity. He then orders the advisor to clean up the new mess immediately. Cold sweat runs down Sign's face as he complains that the prince has been acting strangely. He even threatens to report everything to the empress. The young man remains completely unfazed, knowing the advisor is far too cowardly to approach the empress directly. Deciding to teach him one final lesson, he points toward the young maid standing in the corner and firmly orders her to cover her ears at once. He warns that if she hears even a single word of their confidential conversation, he will cut off her fingers. Terrified by the threat, the maid immediately squeezes her eyes shut and presses both hands tightly over her ears without the slightest hesitation. The young man then steps closer to the frightened advisor and quietly whispers a dark secret into his ear. The moment Sign hears those shocking words, the arrogance disappears from his face. His expression is replaced by absolute terror. He turns deathly pale and breaks into a cold sweat, as though he has come face to face with death itself. Several days later, the castle's courtyard is filled with gossip among the maids. They whisper that the prince has been behaving very strangely lately. One maid nervously admits that he has become far more frightening than before and fears she may not survive much longer if she continues working in the palace. Another servant tries to reassure her, saying that at least the prince has not been leaving his luxurious residence recently. At that moment, one of the maids reminds Anna that she should already be cleaning the royal office. Meanwhile, inside the lavish office, the young man sits comfortably by the window, peacefully reading while enjoying the beautiful scenery outside. Sipping his hot tea with satisfaction, he is pleased that his act of being a spoiled and unpredictable prince has frightened the servants enough to keep their distance. The protagonist is especially happy that Sign has stopped bothering him, saving him from having to throw another teapot at the advisor's head. His peaceful days continue because he knows there is still 1 year before the novel's main story begins and 3 years before the prince's destined death. He fondly remembers discovering Dark Hitter in a library and reading it hundreds of times simply because he loved the story. Since the true protagonist has yet to appear, he decides to relax and make the most of his luxurious new life. As he gazes up at the bright blue sky, he quietly wishes he had wings so he could soar freely through the air and admire the breathtaking scenery from above. Suddenly, a violent and mysterious pain surges through the young man's entire body, instantly taking his breath away. The agony is so overwhelming that all his strength leaves him, causing the porcelain cup in his hand to slip and shatter on the floor. Desperate, he feels an unbearable burning sensation spreading throughout his body, unable to understand why he is suddenly suffering so intensely. Writhing in pain, he realizes this agony is completely different from anything he experienced in his previous life. At that moment, Anna knocks on the office door and politely asks for permission to come in and clean. Meanwhile, the young man silently begs for help as he struggles through the unbearable pain. Receiving no response, Anna slowly opens the door and sighs with relief when she believes the feared prince is not inside. However, her relief quickly vanishes when she notices the shattered pieces of the expensive porcelain cup scattered across the floor. She kneels down and carefully begins collecting the fragments, thinking that even the value of the broken dishware could have fed her family. Suddenly, she hears an unusual sound coming from behind the office curtains. Curious, she walks over to investigate and is stunned to discover a black crow with glowing red eyes staring directly at her inside the luxurious office. The crow hops down onto the floor while Anna cautiously approaches with her broom, wondering how the strange bird managed to get inside. Gently, she picks it up and cradles it in her arms before speaking to it kindly. She says it should leave immediately because a very cruel prince lives in that room. The bird is thrown into complete panic as it looks down at itself and realizes that every attempt to speak comes out as nothing more than a crow's caw. Horrified, the young man realizes that, somehow, he has stopped being Prince Ian Oberon and has transformed into a black crow. Anna sadly tells the bird that she would love to keep it, but if the cruel prince discovers it inside his office, both of them will surely die. The young man desperately tries to shout at her, begging her not to let him go, but all that escapes his beak are meaningless caws. Without realizing his true identity, Anna carries him toward the open window. Then, without hesitation, she tosses the crow from the top of the castle tower. The young man plummets toward the ground in complete terror. Convinced he is about to crash into the forest below, he desperately searches for a way to survive. In a panic, he wonders whether he simply needs to flap his wings. Refusing to die in such a ridiculous way, he focuses all his willpower on moving them. As he falls through the sky, he beats his black wings with every ounce of strength he has. To his surprise, the wind suddenly lifts his body upward. Realizing he has finally learned how to fly, excitement replaces his fear as he soars freely through the clear blue sky. However, that excitement is soon replaced by anxiety as he wonders whether he will ever be able to return to his human body. As night falls over the enormous imperial palace, the mysterious glow of the three-colored moons fills the sky. Fortunately, the young man successfully transforms back into his human form. To make sure it was not a coincidence, he repeatedly switches between his human body and the form of a crow. Fascinated, he confirms that he now possesses the extraordinary ability to transform into a crow whenever he wishes. He begins wondering whether this strange power is somehow connected to the mysterious crow he encountered on his first day, since no such ability ever existed in the original version of Dark Hitter. Even though he cannot understand where this power came from, he quietly closes the window, realizing that he must keep this secret hidden from everyone in the palace. He reflects that an ability which never appeared in the novel could completely change the course of history. Suspecting that his transformation may somehow be connected to Manus, he is interrupted by a servant announcing that the monthly ritual is about to begin. The young prince prepares himself mentally, knowing that the long-awaited day has finally arrived. This sacred ceremony takes place once every month and serves as a test of succession among the imperial heirs. Although the seventh prince is never considered a true contender, experiencing the ceremony firsthand feels completely different. He is forced to sit at the very end of the enormous banquet table, separated from his siblings. His blonde-haired brothers radiate such overwhelming elegance and authority that the black-haired prince seems insignificant by comparison, almost like a lone crow among majestic beings. As he silently endures the mocking stares directed toward him, the prince seated across from him begins provoking him without the slightest shame. That arrogant young man is the 17-year-old prince, Celos, who openly despises his own older brother. Growing impatient when he receives no response, Celos slams his hand onto the table and angrily demands to know whether his brother has suddenly gone deaf. Before the situation can escalate, the first princess gently places a hand on Celos' shoulder and scolds him, reminding him not to cause trouble in the presence of the emperor. The young man carefully studies the seating arrangement and realizes that every prince and princess is seated according to the strict order of royal succession. He remembers that, within the imperial family, the lighter an heir's hair color is, the greater their mastery over manas, the sacred power of this world. In contrast, the original, Ian Oberon, was born with completely black hair, making him the only royal family member who possessed no affinity for this power. However, there is one person whose mastery over manas surpasses everyone else in the empire. At that very moment, the sound of firm, commanding footsteps echoes throughout the grand hall, announcing the arrival of the most powerful and imposing figure in the entire empire. Everyone in the hall immediately bows as the majestic emperor enters, radiating an overwhelming aura of authority and absolute power. Taking his place upon the imperial throne, he wastes no time and orders the succession ritual to begin at once. He walks toward an ancient bluish stone slab, a sacred relic passed down by the very first emperor. Placing his hand upon the magical artifact, he activates the device used to measure the strength of each royal family member. The test is simple. The farther the blue light emitted by the stone travels, the greater the user's power. The young man watches in amazement as a brilliant blue light spreads across the entire table, proving the emperor's overwhelming strength. After removing his hand from the glowing stone, the emperor coldly challenges any of his heirs who wish to demonstrate their own abilities. While most of the princes remain silent, unwilling to step forward, the protagonist quietly observes everything without drawing attention to himself. A moment later, the first prince proudly rises from his seat and accepts his father's challenge. The young man knows this is tradition. Since the order of succession rarely changes, only the first prince usually participates in the ceremony. The ritual is held regularly before the entire royal family to display his immense power and reinforce his position as the future ruler of the empire. However, just as the test begins, the first prince suddenly grimaces in unbearable pain before coughing up blood. The second prince immediately jumps to his feet in shock as he watches his older brother stagger helplessly beside the table. Panic spreads throughout the great hall. The royal family and attendants begin shouting for a physician as chaos erupts all around them. Amid the confusion, the protagonist is the only person who understands exactly what is happening. He knows the first prince is on the verge of death. Watching him continue coughing up horrifying amounts of blood, the young man realizes with a heavy heart that the main events of Dark Hitter have finally begun. Within the imperial bloodline, every royal inherits a unique Manus ability. The first prince possesses complete mastery over water, while the second prince commands fire with unmatched skill. The outcome of today's ceremony was supposed to be predictable. According to the novel, the first prince's power should only have extended halfway across the table. Everything had matched the story perfectly until now. Then the young man notices something that fills him with dread. The first prince's fatal illness has appeared 6 months earlier than it should have. Panic grips him as he realizes history has already begun changing. At the same time, he questions how the powerless body of Ian Oberon suddenly gained the mysterious ability to transform into a crow. The timing cannot be a coincidence. Ever since he arrived in this world, an entirely new power has appeared, one that never existed in the original novel. Later that night, the young man secretly slips into the second prince's chambers. He knows the blonde prince possesses overwhelming physical strength, making him one of the most dangerous people in the palace. Seeing the unexpected intruder, the second prince smiles mockingly, assuming an assassin has broken into his room. However, his expression changes the moment he recognizes his younger brother. Remaining perfectly calm, the protagonist sarcastically replies that if he truly were an assassin, the blonde prince would already be lying dead on the floor. The second prince is left speechless. He cannot believe that the supposedly powerless seventh prince managed to infiltrate his heavily guarded chambers without leaving behind a single trace. Meanwhile, inside his own royal quarters, the first prince falls into a fit of uncontrollable rage. Furious, he smashes one expensive object after another before driving his fist into a large glass mirror. He bitterly laments that everything had been perfectly normal only that very morning. As he continues striking the mirror, he suddenly freezes. Something feels terribly wrong. The sacred Manus flowing through his body begins behaving in a way it never has before. Without warning, he collapses to his knees, trembling violently as an unbearable burning sensation spreads throughout his body. Every attempt to use his power only makes the pain worse. Horrified, he realizes his body feels as though it is engulfed in flames whenever he channels Manus, and he begins fearing that he may never be able to use his abilities again. Unable to accept reality, he desperately shouts that such a thing is impossible. After all, he is the first crown prince and the future emperor of the empire. Trying to compose himself, he tightly grips the hookah beside him, repeatedly reminding himself that he is far superior to all of his brothers. Just then, a mysterious voice echoes from the darkness of the room. It calmly advises the crown prince to let go of the hookah if he wishes to stay alive. Startled, the prince immediately turns toward the source of the voice and angrily demands to know who dared to trespass into his private chambers. The crown prince angrily demands to know how the intruder managed to enter his private chambers. The black-haired young man calmly replies that he simply climbed the palace wall. The prince refuses to believe such an absurd explanation, but the young man casually points toward the window at the top of the towering castle, making it clear that he is telling the truth. He then asks the crown prince how he is feeling, already aware that the palace physicians have been lying about the heir's true condition. The first prince responds with a mocking laugh, desperately trying to hide the fear growing inside him after hearing such a direct question. His laughter becomes louder and increasingly forced as he struggles to regain the dignity and confidence expected of the future emperor. Watching the act with complete indifference, the protagonist remarks that the crown prince is slightly smarter than he initially appeared. The heir immediately accuses his younger brother of secretly poisoning him, believing the seventh prince intends to use the antidote as leverage once the time comes to fight for the throne. Furious, he steps forward and calls his brother a fool for thinking such a childish scheme could ever succeed inside the imperial palace. The black-haired prince remains perfectly calm before coldly declaring that, within a single week, the crown prince will be begging for death while blood pours from his eyes. Those horrifying words instantly freeze the crown prince in place. For the first time, genuine fear overwhelms him, leaving him unable to respond. The protagonist calmly sits down on a nearby sofa and firmly explains that he neither poisoned nor trapped him. Instead, he reveals that the prince's body will continue deteriorating until death. Although he admits he still does not know who is truly responsible, he stresses that listening to his advice from this moment onward is absolutely essential. He makes it perfectly clear that this conversation is the crown prince's final and only chance to survive. Having delivered his warning, the young man transforms into a crow and flies out through the window. He leaves feeling satisfied, knowing that, just like in the novel, the first prince is far more cowardly and easier to manipulate than he appears. Confident that he can now use the crown prince as a pawn, the young man believes his own chances of surviving within the empire have increased significantly. Flying through the pouring rain, he realizes just how convenient his new ability is. His crow form allows him to travel anywhere in the palace without attracting suspicion. Since he is already outside, he decides to take advantage of the stormy night and explore more of the imperial palace. The black crow soars through the heavy rain above the empire's great capital, slicing through the darkness beneath the mysterious three-colored moons. The following morning, warm sunlight bathes the magnificent imperial palace, replacing the previous night's gloomy atmosphere with peace and tranquility. Outside the prince's chambers, Anna grows increasingly worried. The prince has neither eaten nor shown himself for 2 entire days. Panic begins to consume her as she imagines that the prince has died inside his room. Terrified that she will be executed for the crime of assassinating a member of the royal family, she desperately pounds on the wooden door while repeatedly calling out to him. Receiving no answer, she hurriedly opens the door. To her complete surprise, the prince calmly walks out of his room and lazily asks why she is making so much noise. Startled, Anna accidentally slips across the floor and falls face first, sending the entire meal on her silver tray flying everywhere. To make matters even worse, the hot soup splashes directly onto the prince's boots. Frozen with terror, Anna remains on the floor while the young man silently looks down at the stain on his footwear without changing his expression. The terrified maid immediately bursts into tears, desperately begging for forgiveness. She explains that she only wanted to make sure the prince was healthy and safe. She continues apologizing over and over, crying uncontrollably, while the young man grows increasingly annoyed by what he considers an unnecessary overreaction. Fixing her with an intimidating stare, he asks how she intends to take responsibility for dirtying both the floor and his boots. After a brief pause, he decides not to pursue the matter. Instead, he coldly orders her to clean everything within 5 minutes and disappear from his sight immediately afterward. Satisfied with the result, the protagonist walks away, believing that his strict attitude will ensure Anna never disturbs him in his quarters again. 1 month passes after the succession ritual. The young man's room is now overflowing with magical books, their pages and scrolls scattered across the floor as he continues studying relentlessly. During that month, a dangerous rumor spreads throughout the empire claiming that the first prince has completely lost his manners. To the other royal heirs, this rumor represents the perfect opportunity to challenge the line of succession and seize power for themselves. Determined to silence the growing gossip, the first prince personally asks the emperor to move the famous royal hunting competition forward. Mounted on horseback, the young man notices that events are still unfolding much like they did in Dark Hitter. Even so, he cannot stop wondering whether the arrival of the true protagonist has also been affected by the changes in history. Today is the day of the royal hunt. His plan is to meet the novel's true protagonist, hand over an important item, and patiently wait for the perfect opportunity to act. Before he can move, however, the arrogant 8th prince rides over on horseback and mockingly calls his older brother a useless insect. He sneers that the black horse perfectly matches the 7th prince's gloomy personality, while the young man quietly worries that the reckless prince's impulsive behavior may cause unnecessary trouble. The young man decides to ignore his brother's insults, choosing instead to focus on the important event awaiting him. His indifference only makes the 8th prince even angrier. Mounting his black horse, the black-haired prince quietly thinks that the dark steed suits him far better than any golden horse ever could. Looking ahead with a serious expression, he finally breathes a sigh of relief as they arrive at their destination. Standing before the enormous entrance to the imperial forest, the young man silently prepares himself for what is about to unfold. His eyes drift toward the towering structure at the edge of the forest, where the annual opening ceremony of the royal hunt is traditionally held. He remembers that the competition will officially begin as soon as the first prince completes the sacred ritual. In reality, however, he knows the entire event is nothing more than a grand political spectacle designed to impress the empire's nobility. The emperor coldly orders the first prince to step forward and prepare for the ceremonial display of strength. Prince Dido approaches with a sarcastic smile and asks whether his older brother has already decided what wish he will make. He is referring to the special privilege granted to the winner of the royal hunt, who may request a single favor directly from the emperor at the end of the competition. The first prince calmly walks toward the altar to demonstrate his manners before the gathered nobles. As he takes his position, whispers begin spreading through the crowd. The nobles quietly discuss the recent rumors, claiming that something terrible has happened to the crown prince. Cold sweat forms on the first prince's forehead as he desperately hopes the supposedly useless 7th prince had not lied about the method to save his life. Watching from a distance, the protagonist simply smiles to himself, already knowing exactly what is about to happen. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince silently swears that if everything turns out to be a trick, he will make his younger brother suffer the most painful death imaginable. Noticing how stiff and tense his brother looks, the protagonist sarcastically thinks that he should relax before the test begins. He knows that if the Crown Prince followed his instructions exactly as he was told, something extraordinary is about to happen. Without warning, an enormous wave of brilliant blue energy erupts violently from the Crown Prince's body. The overwhelming blast spreads across the area like a raging hurricane, terrifying the nobles gathered to witness the ceremony. The magical energy continues, expanding uncontrollably, creating a powerful storm that engulfs the entire royal courtyard. Violent winds throw several spectators backward as frightened screams fill the air. The Imperial Guards immediately order everyone to retreat before anyone is seriously injured by the destructive surge of manas. Even while suffering unbearable pain, the first prince forces himself to endure. Clenching his teeth as blood trickles from the corner of his mouth, he reminds himself that he is the rightful heir to the throne. Roaring with determination, he declares that he alone is destined to rule the empire before unleashing an even greater torrent of power. The vast ocean of magical energy suddenly takes the form of a colossal sea monster rising high into the sky. Moments later, the enormous creature dissolves into countless shimmering droplets, transforming into a beautiful rain of blue light that gently falls across the courtyard. As the magical storm finally fades away, complete silence fills the area. The gathered nobles stare in stunned amazement at the breathtaking display of imperial power. Even the most seasoned warriors cannot hide their admiration, acknowledging that the strength of the imperial bloodline is truly extraordinary. The silence is quickly replaced by thunderous cheers as the entire crowd erupts in celebration. Raising his fist high into the air, the first prince proudly accepts their applause. The story then flashes back to an earlier conversation in which the protagonist hands the crown prince a mysterious black stone. He instructs him to pour his manas into the artifact, calmly explaining that it absorbs the corrupted energy, slowly destroying his body from within. Without sugarcoating the truth, the young man tells him that he has no intention of saving someone who would rather reject his help and die. Returning to the present, the protagonist quietly celebrates his decision to use that legendary artifact ahead of schedule, knowing it has allowed him to gain a valuable ally within the imperial court. A short while later, Sign reappears, exhausted and trembling beneath the weight of an enormous black backpack. Struggling to catch his breath, he respectfully reports that he has delivered the heavy bag exactly as instructed. The protagonist casually remarks that the advisor took longer than expected to arrive. At that moment, the crown prince fixes Sign with a frightening stare and coldly asks whether the useless subordinate dared to touch anything inside the bag. Meanwhile, Sign silently complains to himself about surviving the wild horse that he had deliberately selected, hoping it would injure the crown prince during the journey. Before anyone can continue the conversation, the loud blast of a ceremonial trumpet echoes throughout the valley, officially announcing the beginning of the imperial hunting competition. The emperor raises his hand with commanding authority and loudly declares the start of this year's royal hunting competition. At once, the knights and warriors line up, ready to charge into the vast forest. As the signal is given, the participants rush forward with excitement. Some dream of claiming victory, while others already know that a member of the imperial family almost always wins the tournament. The protagonist chooses to keep a low profile, knowing that winning the competition is not part of his plan. Instead, he intends to use the event to locate the former commander of the Imperial Knights and recruit him as a valuable ally. Nearby, a young man wearing glasses excitedly tells his lord that the crown prince's display of power looked almost divine. The duke smiles knowingly and admits that the emperor's true intention was never simply to measure strength. Rather, it was to intimidate the nobles and crush any pride they still possessed. His assistant immediately panics and begs the duke to keep such dangerous opinions to himself unless they are completely alone. The seasoned warrior chuckles, replying that he knows exactly how to survive in an imperial court filled with conspiracies and constant danger. The narration explains that the enormous imperial forest is divided into 3 separate hunting zones. The outer region contains small animals, while the deepest section is home to powerful and dangerous magical beasts. The young man remembers that, in the original story of Dark Hitter, the duke presented the emperor with a rare golden fox after the hunt. However, the novel never revealed exactly where the creature could be found. That uncertainty is precisely why he previously explored the entire forest in his crow form, secretly mapping the locations of various beasts. Based on a small detail from the novel that the duke washed his hands in a lake after catching the fox, the protagonist deduces that the golden fox must live near a lake in the southwestern part of the forest. Determined to arrive before the duke, the prince urges his horse forward. He cannot help but feel that the intelligent black horse understands every word he says. He also feels relieved that Sign successfully delivered the heavy backpack filled with precious gemstones, which he intends to offer to the Duke as a gift. The black horse gallops through the forest at tremendous speed, while the heavy bag bounces dangerously on the prince's back. Without warning, the horse comes to an abrupt stop, nearly throwing its rider onto the forest floor. Startled, the young man barely manages to keep his balance. Looking at the horse in confusion, he asks why it stopped so suddenly. When he asks whether it is tired or feeling unwell, the horse shakes its head. The prince then wonders if it has sensed a dangerous beast nearby. A disturbing thought suddenly crosses his mind. His eyes widen in disbelief as he slowly asks whether the backpack is simply too heavy. The horse immediately nods without the slightest hint of shame. The young man shouts in frustration, pointing out that ordinary horses pull massive wagons every day, yet this one is complaining about carrying nothing more than a single backpack. He threatens to stop feeding the horse if it continues behaving so arrogantly and refuses to move. In response, the stubborn animal stomps one hoof heavily against the ground, making it perfectly clear that it does not care about the threat. Then, without another moment's hesitation, the horse suddenly sprints away, abandoning the young prince in the middle of the forest with the heavy backpack still on his shoulders. Watching the horse disappear into the distance, the young man sighs in disbelief as he realizes he has been left completely alone deep within the woods. Elsewhere in the forest, the Duke calmly walks beneath the trees, believing that hunting wolves and deer should be an easy task. His young assistant comments that luck does not seem to be on their side today, since they have not encountered a single suitable prey. The experienced Duke quietly reflects that he is growing old and that even the greatest warriors cannot defeat the passage of time. The bespectacled assistant immediately objects, insisting with sincere admiration that his lord has already become a living legend throughout the empire. He proudly recalls the Duke's countless military achievements during his years as commander of the Imperial Knights. The old warrior simply smiles and dismisses the praise, describing himself as nothing more than a retired soldier. After a brief silence, the Duke asks his assistant whether he has ever seen the imperial family up close. The young man admits that he has only ever observed them from afar. The Duke replies that only by standing before them in person can someone truly understand who holds absolute power over the empire. The story then shifts into a flashback. Years earlier, the Duke's father explained that the imperial bloodline ruled the empire as though they were living gods. He proudly told his son that one day he would inherit the family's responsibilities and should always take pride in serving the magnificent imperial family with unwavering loyalty. He also showed him the family's enormous merchant fleet, which supplied countless valuable resources directly to the royal household. Their peaceful conversation was suddenly interrupted when the carriage lurched violently. Annoyed, the nobleman demanded to know what had happened. The coachman nervously apologized, explaining that something had become lodged beneath the carriage wheels. He begged his master to remain inside while he removed the obstruction himself. Ignoring the warning, the nobleman stepped outside and looked beneath the carriage. There he found the lifeless body of a small child lying motionless on the road. Fresh blood stained the heavy wooden wheels, revealing the horrifying reality of the fatal accident. The nobleman soon learned that the victim was a young orphan who had been accused of stealing offerings from the sacred temple. He realized with quiet horror that tragedies involving orphan children were heartbreakingly common in the capital's everyday life. The young and innocent boy asks his father what is happening outside and cheerfully says that he wants to go see the commotion as well. His father suddenly raises his voice in panic, sternly ordering the child to remain inside the luxurious carriage. The boy is frightened and confused by his father's harsh reaction, unaware that the man is desperately trying to shield him from the horrifying scene outside. Concealing the tragic truth, the father coldly tells his son that nothing important has happened, hoping to spare him from witnessing such cruelty. Back in the present, the Duke recalls that painful memory and quietly reflects that the orphan child had not even reached the age of 10. He sadly remembers how the boy's body was burned after the accident and cannot help wondering how much darkness truly lies beneath the empire's glorious appearance. His bespectacled assistant interrupts his thoughts, reminding him that they must hurry if they wish to protect the honor and prestige of the Duke's family. Apologizing for becoming distracted, the experienced noble smiles and reveals that he knows a secret location where the rare golden fox usually appears. Meanwhile, the protagonist runs through the forest, exhausted from carrying the enormous backpack. Grumbling to himself, he swears that once he returns to the palace, he will turn his lazy horse into barbecue. The heavy load prevents him from transforming into a crow, making him worry that he will lose the Duke's trail if he continues moving at such a slow pace. He also remembers that even the outer hunting grounds, supposedly filled with harmless animals, can suddenly become dangerous if wild beasts appear. Without warning, a nearby bush begins rustling. The prince immediately stops and prepares himself for a possible attack. Cursing his own carelessness for entering the forest without bringing a weapon, he considers fleeing instead of fighting. As a precaution, he picks up a rock and throws it toward the moving bushes. To his horror, the projectile strikes a young man wearing glasses squarely in the face, cutting off his words with a painful cry. The moment the protagonist notices the boy's unusual bluish hair, his expression freezes in shock. He instantly realizes that he has attacked the wrong person. Hearing the commotion from a distance, the Duke immediately rushes toward the scene, anxiously calling his assistant's name as he runs through the dense forest. Looking at the unconscious young man lying on the ground, the protagonist realizes with growing dread that he has just knocked out the Duke's trusted aide. The poor assistant, Talon, collapses onto the grass with blood running down his face after being struck by the rock. The young man falls into complete despair, realizing he has just created a massive problem involving one of the most powerful nobles in the empire. He remembers that the Duke is a legendary war hero and the former commander of the Imperial Knights, respected throughout the entire kingdom. He also knows that this same warrior will eventually become the mentor of the novel's true protagonist, the person destined to shake the empire to its very foundations. His original plan had been completely different. He intended to falsely accuse the Duke of attempting to steal royal prey during the hunt, giving himself an excuse to punish the old warrior unfairly. His real goal was to force the Duke to carry the heavy backpack, filled with magical stones, throughout the entire hunting competition. Now, biting his lip in frustration, the protagonist watches his carefully prepared scheme collapse in an instant because of a single stroke of bad luck. The Duke examines the rock lying beside Talon and immediately concludes that it was deliberately thrown by someone hiding nearby. He quickly begins suspecting that the attack was actually a failed assassination attempt aimed at him. Little by little, Talon starts regaining consciousness as the Duke kneels beside him. The worried warrior gently tells the young man to stay calm and asks whether he remembers anything about the attacker. The protagonist panics. If rumors spread that he attempted to assault the Duke's companion, his own life could be in serious danger. Despite his injuries, Talon struggles to recall what he saw before the rock struck him. Watching nervously from behind the tree, the prince desperately searches for some way to stop the boy from identifying him. Fortunately for the protagonist, Talon suddenly loses consciousness once again before he can reveal the culprit. The young man quietly lets out a long sigh of relief, silently thanking his luck for saving him from immediate exposure. That relief lasts only a moment. A faint rustling sound echoes through the nearby bushes. The Duke instantly turns toward the source with a murderous glare. Fixing his sharp eyes on the trees, the experienced warrior becomes certain that the mysterious attacker is still hiding somewhere nearby. The young man seizes the opportunity while the Duke is distracted and sprints away with all his strength, fleeing deeper into the forest. Drawing his sword, the Duke tells the injured, Talon, to stay where he is before taking off in pursuit of the mysterious attacker. Branches shake violently as the relentless chase races through the dense vegetation of the imperial forest. The prince's legs begin to give out from exhaustion, and he complains that the heavy backpack is making it almost impossible to breathe while running. Trying to calm himself, he convinces himself that he has already put enough distance between them to lose an elderly warrior like the Duke. The very next moment, the old man suddenly leaps out directly behind him with terrifying speed. The prince is left speechless. He had believed the retired commander would never be able to move so quickly. The Duke shouts for the fleeing stranger to reveal his identity. Realizing he will soon be caught, the young man desperately searches for a solution. He hesitates, wondering whether he should abandon the valuable backpack so he can transform into a crow. At the same time, he bitterly regrets not having his unusually fast horse beside him. Refusing to give up, he concentrates every ounce of magical energy within his body and forces it into his legs. A violent burst of wind explodes around him. The sudden acceleration launches the prince forward like a streak of lightning, causing him to disappear in an instant. The Duke watches in surprise, noticing that the fleeing figure's silhouette seemed to change for a brief moment. Swinging his sword through empty air, the old warrior clicks his tongue in frustration, blaming his aging eyesight for allowing the mysterious intruder to escape. Landing in an empty clearing, he scans the surrounding forest with disappointment, realizing he has completely lost the trail. Meanwhile, the protagonist suddenly notices that his body feels far lighter than before. For a moment, he wonders whether he accidentally transformed into a crow. Just then, he hears the rhythmic sound of hooves striking the ground. Surprised, he assumes his troublesome black horse has finally returned. However, after looking at his reflection, he freezes. He realizes he has not transformed into a crow at all. Instead, he has become a magnificent black horse, galloping gracefully across the rolling hills. Elsewhere in the forest, Prince Dido stands before the enormous corpse of a gigantic beast, unable to hide his amazement. He wonders aloud whether his older brother was truly the one who defeated such a terrifying monster. The two golden-haired princes stand beside the lifeless body of a massive saber-toothed bear. The younger prince congratulates the crown prince on what appears to be a guaranteed victory and asks whether he has already decided what wish he will request from the emperor. A dark smile spreads across the crown prince's face as he calmly replies that he already has the perfect plan in mind. Meanwhile, the protagonist returns to his human form and collapses beneath the shade of a large tree to catch his breath. Holding his head in both hands, he sinks into despair as he realizes just how badly everything has gone. Looking down at his empty hands, he suddenly remembers that he lost the precious backpack during his desperate escape. The prince throws himself onto the grass and rolls across the ground in frustration, mourning the loss of the single most important item in his entire plan. Lying flat on his back beneath the trees, he sighs deeply, exhausted and irritated by the disastrous turn the royal hunt has taken. Eventually, he forces himself to calm down. Taking a deep breath, he decides there is no point complaining anymore. The only option left is to retrace his entire route and search for the missing backpack. Back at the scene of the earlier attack, Talon slowly regains consciousness and sits up, asking whether his respected master has returned. The Duke kneels beside him and asks with concern whether he is feeling any better. Talon admits that he is still somewhat dizzy. Ashamed that he failed to catch the mysterious intruder, the old warrior quietly blames himself for growing too old. He then points toward the backpack he discovered lying abandoned in the grass during the pursuit. Examining it closely, Talon becomes confused when he discovers that the supposedly valuable bag is filled with nothing but ordinary stones. Hidden behind a nearby tree, the protagonist breaks into a nervous sweat, desperately hoping they will assume everything was some kind of meaningless prank. Suddenly, he decides to reveal himself. Stepping out from his hiding place, he loudly points toward the backpack, pretending to have just discovered it. Talon immediately recognizes the seventh prince and instinctively points toward him in surprise. Even the Duke is caught completely off guard by the prince's sudden appearance. Without hesitation, both men kneel respectfully to greet the imperial prince. The Duke politely asks whether the backpack belongs to his highness. Putting on a cold and intimidating expression, the young man pretends to feel relieved and confirms that he has been searching for it. His tone suddenly hardens. He sternly asks whether the two men intended to steal his belongings. The accusation immediately puts the veteran warrior on edge. The Duke quickly explains that they merely found the backpack abandoned in the middle of the forest. The prince coldly replies that anyone facing such an accusation would naturally deny it to avoid losing a hand. In response, the Duke solemnly swears upon his family's honor that he is telling nothing but the truth. The crown prince notices the bruises on Talon's face and asks what happened. Growing slightly nervous, the Duke calmly replies that it was nothing more than a minor accident. The injured young man remains completely silent, trembling before the overwhelming presence of the prince. At that moment, the protagonist remembers throwing the rock that struck Talon in the face and struggles to hide his guilt. Just as Talon attempts to speak to the prince, the atmosphere instantly becomes even more tense. Without warning, the prince steps forward and grabs the young man by the hair, shocking the Duke, who never expected such a violent display. With arrogant disdain, the crown prince scolds Talon for daring to interrupt a conversation involving royalty. He then turns to the Duke and coldly asks whether he would be willing to lend him a sword so that he can personally deal with the insolent commoner. The terrified young assistant trembles uncontrollably, convinced that his life is hanging by a thread. The Duke immediately apologizes for his subordinate's behavior, hoping to calm the prince's anger. The prince simply smiles and praises the veteran warrior's unwavering loyalty. Privately, however, he thinks that the Duke behaves like a perfectly obedient dog of the empire, silently enduring humiliation without showing the slightest resistance. Continuing his provocation, the prince cruelly remarks that the Duke's son will surely grow up to become another obedient servant of the imperial family. Those words bring back memories of his frightened son, causing a surge of anger to rise within the Duke's heart. The young man then hands the heavy backpack back to the veteran warrior. He calmly remarks that perhaps fate brought them together today and claims that he has decided to place his trust in them. Fixing the Duke with a cold stare, he orders him to guard the backpack with his life and never allow it to be lost under any circumstances. The crown prince sternly asks whether his orders are understood. Silently gripping the backpack, the Duke lowers his head before solemnly promising that he will faithfully carry out every command given by his highness. Satisfied, the prince bids them farewell, wishes them good luck in the hunt, and walks away, secretly pleased that he no longer has to carry the heavy burden himself. As he leaves, he quietly admits to himself that he treated both men terribly. Even so, he believes the cruelty was necessary. His goal was to plant the first seed. After the prince departs, Talon apologizes to his master for everything that happened. The Duke tells him that he was fortunate to escape with his life and suggests that they return to camp so he can rest. Suddenly, Talon remembers an important detail about the mysterious attacker. With a serious expression, he reveals that the person who threw the rock at him was none other than the seventh prince. Before he can say anything else, the experienced Duke sharply cuts him off and orders him never to speak of the matter again. The protagonist knows that, in the original story of Dark Hitter, the Duke does not rebel against the imperial family until the following year, after suffering the heartbreaking loss of his only son. His plan is to move that rebellion forward. To accomplish that, he knows he must give the old warrior a powerful emotional push. Elsewhere, the arrogant blonde prince reveals the wish he intends to request from the emperor if he wins the royal hunt. He plans to clear the entire district surrounding the sacred temple, driving out the poor citizens of the capital as though they were nothing more than worthless insects. Watching everything from a distance, the protagonist understands that the Duke's tragic fate has already been written into history. The old general continues walking through the forest with a heavy backpack on his shoulders, quietly reflecting on his place within the empire. The young man knows that one day the veteran warrior is destined to lead a massive rebellion against the imperial family. That is the path history has prepared for him. As the sun slowly sets, golden light spreads across the towering mountains and the dense forests surrounding the imperial palace. Hidden among the bushes, the prince carefully checks that no one witnessed him landing after transforming back from his crow form. He feels a brief sense of guilt over how cruelly he treated the Duke and Talon. That feeling quickly fades. After all, he reminds himself that he now occupies the role of the story's greatest villain. While planning his next move after the tournament ends, he suddenly notices someone standing directly ahead. The Empire's first princess gracefully approaches and remarks that it is unusual to see her younger brother wandering through the forest alone. The young man immediately grows tense. He knows the first princess is one of the most dangerous members of the imperial family, and he cannot understand why she would be in such an isolated place. He respectfully offers a formal greeting. However, she gently tells him to forget the formalities, reminding him that they share the same royal blood. Curious, she asks why he is traveling on foot instead of riding his horse. Without missing a beat, the prince casually replies that he simply wanted to take a walk and enjoy the fresh air. The first princess's expression suddenly turns cold as she calmly says that his explanation makes no sense. Fixing him with a piercing stare, she asks why he feels the need to lie to his own family. The young prince swallows nervously and tries to hide his unease by asking what exactly she means. The princess explains that she found a riderless horse wandering through the forest, and her attendants confirm that it belonged to him. Without hesitation, he fabricates a story, claiming that he ordered the horse to be executed because any animal that disobeys its master deserves no mercy. He kneels respectfully and pretends to regret his actions, apologizing and insisting that he acted impulsively after feeling ashamed for losing control of the horse. The princess gently tells him to lift his head, smiling as she explains that she does not wish to appear as though she is punishing her younger brother. She says she is simply relieved that he is safe and kindly reminds him that he can request another horse whenever he wishes. As she walks away, the young man quietly watches her, convinced that she is an incredibly difficult person to read. He wonders why she left without pressing him further and begins to suspect that perhaps her mysterious ability does not work on him. Night falls over the imperial hunting camp, and a serious conversation unfolds inside one of the tents. The physician listens to Talon's unbelievable explanation before asking whether he truly injured himself by tripping over a rock. The doctor remarks that he has never seen anyone suffer such severe injuries from such an ordinary accident during an official royal hunt. Concerned, the Duke asks about Talon's condition. The physician replies that the internal injuries are serious and orders him to spend an entire week resting. Talon becomes visibly disappointed after learning that he will miss the remainder of the tournament. The Duke places a reassuring hand on his shoulder and praises his loyalty. He orders Talon to rest until the competition ends, promising that he and Jack will handle everything else. The young assistant smiles brightly and promises to recover as quickly as possible by faithfully following his master's orders. Laughing, the Duke jokes that taking a vacation in the middle of a royal hunt is something he has never witnessed before. Talon laughs and admits that his greatest dream is to live without ever having to work. The veteran warrior bursts into laughter and jokingly promises to win the tournament and asks the emperor for a gold mine so his loyal companion's dream can finally come true. Later that night, only a flickering candle lights the quiet tent as Talon sleeps soundly. He snores peacefully, making the most of his unexpected break from the competition. Without warning, a mysterious figure quietly places a sealed scroll beside the sleeping young man's head before disappearing into the darkness. Elsewhere, the crown prince smiles to himself with a sinister expression, remarking that the Duke behaves like a loyal dog who never notices the dangers surrounding those closest to him. Unable to sleep, the old Duke sits alone in the darkness, holding his head as he recalls the prince's cruel provocations. His restless thoughts refuse to settle, so he leaves his tent in search of some fresh air. The moment he steps outside, he freezes in shock. Standing at the entrance of his tent is the mysterious backpack. Looking down in confusion, he notices that the ordinary stones inside have begun to glow faintly while vibrating in a disturbing manner. Placing the backpack over his shoulder, the Duke sets off through the forest beneath the light of the three moons, intending to visit the sacred temple. As he walks, he remembers telling his young son the ancient legend of the divine savior who descended from the heavens to bring an end to chaos. The little boy had smiled excitedly, proudly saying that he had already read everything about the legendary hero, Sierra the Great, in his books. The Duke had explained that the godlike figure possessed miraculous powers, defeated countless enemies, united the land, and ultimately founded the mighty empire along with the imperial bloodline that still rules to this day. Lost in thought, the old warrior gazes toward the distant horizon, remembering that his beloved son has always been the greatest treasure in his life. He once encouraged the boy to follow in his footsteps, become a great warrior, and one day serve as the proud sword of the imperial family. Returning to the present, the Duke grumbles about the incredible weight of the backpack and questions why he ever agreed to carry a bag full of ordinary stones. He cannot decide whether he continues out of loyalty or fear. Before he can think any further, the loud blast of a horn echoes across the forest. The experienced warrior immediately recognizes the unmistakable sound of the Empire's sacred trumpet. Throughout the hunting camp, nobles are startled awake as the cries of countless beasts echo through the forest during the night. Rumors quickly spread that the blonde crown prince has defeated every monster in the hunting grounds, bringing the tournament to an early conclusion. The royal announcer officially declares that the 4-day hunting competition has ended after only a single night because of the crown prince's unprecedented achievement. The first prince is proclaimed the undisputed champion of the royal hunt. The mighty emperor personally congratulates his eldest son, who respectfully bows before him in accordance with imperial tradition. The emperor orders the crown prince to announce his wish before everyone gathered at the ceremony. The crowd begins whispering among themselves, recalling the extraordinary requests granted to past winners of the royal hunting competition. The crown prince steps forward and explains that countless beggars have settled around the sacred temple, claiming they threaten the dignity and safety of the holy grounds. A cruel smile spreads across his face as he declares his wish. He asks for permission to restore the temple's beauty by permanently clearing the area and eradicating every unwanted resident from its surroundings. The Duke falls into despair the moment he hears the request. He immediately imagines the horrifying scene that will follow imperial soldiers mercilessly slaughtering innocent civilians. The blonde crown prince formally asks the emperor to authorize the brutal purge of the temple district. As those words echo through the courtyard, the Duke recalls the voice of his beloved son calling out to him. Memories filled with fear and blood flood his mind. In the darkness of his thoughts, he hears his son's desperate voice once more. With trembling resolve, the old warrior draws his massive sword. He realizes that he has spent his entire life serving the empire like a loyal hound, but he refuses to let his son inherit that same fate. The experienced general steps forward with his weapon in hand, leaving the assembled nobles stunned. Looking down at his blade, he silently apologizes to his son for the difficult choice he is about to make. Meanwhile, Talon slowly opens his eyes, still groggy from sleep. As he tries to gather his thoughts, he suddenly notices the black-haired prince hanging upside down in front of him, silently staring at him. Startled, Talon tumbles out of bed and hurriedly attempts to greet the prince. The young man casually tells him to relax. He tosses Talon a bundle of medicinal herbs, saying they will help relieve his pain. Confused, the young assistant respectfully asks why the prince has come to visit him. Ignoring the question entirely, the prince coldly asks whether Talon has any idea of the dangerous situation the Duke has placed himself in. The mention of the closing ceremony leaves Talon wide-eyed with confusion. Without wasting another second, the prince orders him to run to the ceremony immediately. Talon dashes from the tent at full speed. He pushes through crowds of soldiers and spectators, desperately trying to force his way toward the center of the gathering. After finally slipping past the line of guards, he freezes in horror. His beloved master is kneeling in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by heavily armed royal guards and facing the furious blonde crown prince. The first prince angrily demands to know what the Duke believes he is doing. Standing proudly despite the danger, the old general declares that his noble family has faithfully protected the imperial throne for over 1,000 years. He respectfully argues that the people living near the sacred temple deserve compassion rather than slaughter. The Duke then presents his humble request directly to the emperor, leaving the crown prince speechless. After a brief silence, the Emperor grants the request in recognition of the veteran warrior's unwavering loyalty. The blond prince grits his teeth in barely restrained fury. Even so, the Emperor smiles and remarks that it is strangely amusing to see the Duke's loyalty conflict with the wishes of the imperial family itself. Unable to contain his rage, the first prince unleashes a massive wave of magical energy. He furiously shouts that anyone who dares oppose the royal family deserves no mercy. According to him, the Duke has committed an unforgivable crime by challenging royalty and should be executed immediately. Closing his eyes, the old warrior calmly accepts his fate. He declares that he is willing to give his life as payment for interfering with the royal hunt. Watching from the crowd, Talon cries out in anguish as he sees his master moments away from execution beneath the overwhelming force of the prince's magic. From a distance, the protagonist quietly watches the scene unfold. Satisfied, he realizes that the Great Rebellion has finally begun exactly as he intended. Elsewhere, beside a peaceful river deep within the forest, a mysterious young man wearing a brown cloak calmly fills a water flask. Without warning, the water begins floating into the air, swirling with strange magical energy. The cloaked youth watches the phenomenon with curiosity, unable to understand why the water is behaving so unnaturally. A colossal explosion of brilliant blue magic suddenly erupts above the distant forest, illuminating the horizon and signaling that the execution has already begun. The story finally reveals the young traveler's identity. He is Radel, the true protagonist of Dark Hitter. For years, the old Duke had been celebrated as one of the Empire's greatest war heroes, leading countless battles and defending the realm with unwavering loyalty. Now, however, that legendary warrior has been reduced to a condemned criminal, kneeling before the imperial family as he awaits his sentence for daring to oppose the will of royalty. The blonde crown prince raises his hand and solemnly announces the immediate execution of the rebellious duke. A massive vortex of freezing water erupts around the veteran warrior, violently imprisoning him within its crushing currents. The gathered nobles watch the overwhelming display of royal power in complete silence, fully convinced that the duke will not survive. Trapped inside the sphere of enchanted water, the old general desperately struggles for air as the immense pressure slowly begins to suffocate him. As darkness closes in around him, he suddenly notices a familiar silhouette within the swirling water. Startled, the Duke recognizes Talon and wonders how his loyal assistant could have ended up in such danger. Remembering the young man's earlier excuse about feeling dizzy, he smiles faintly, relieved to realize that Talon is still alive and unharmed. Although he regrets meeting such a miserable end, he silently prays that Talon will look after his beloved son once he is gone. Through the churning water, the Duke notices the calm figure of the seventh prince watching him from a distance. Even while drowning, he focuses on the prince's lips, trying to understand the silent message being conveyed. With an unreadable expression, the black-haired prince mouths a simple warning. "It is not your time to die yet." Those silent words reignite the old warrior's determination. His fading spirit flares back to life as he vows that he refuses to die here. Meanwhile, the arrogant blonde crown prince raises his arm once more, preparing to unleash the finishing blow. A colossal pillar of brilliant blue light suddenly erupts into the sky, bathing the entire hunting camp in dazzling magical energy. The enormous sphere of enchanted water violently implodes, releasing a devastating shockwave that tears through the valley. As the magical explosion scatters everything nearby, the stones hidden inside the Duke's backpack spill across the ground. The blonde prince stares in disbelief as his execution spell collapses before his eyes. Nearby, Talon cries out in despair while royal guards restrain him, preventing him from rushing into the arena. Watching everything unfold with unwavering composure, the black-haired prince quietly begins calculating his next move. Elsewhere, a young boy sits peacefully, writing in his diary until a brilliant flash outside his window suddenly catches his attention. Looking outside, he watches in amazement as a gigantic streak of blue light silently cuts across the night sky. Back in the forest, the mysterious young man wearing a brown cloak follows the same brilliant beam with his eyes. Without hesitation, he sprints through the forest, leaping over bushes and fallen trees as he races toward the source of the mysterious light. A tremendous explosion of wind and earth shakes the valley, revealing the terrifying force of the magical blast. With remarkable agility, the cloaked youth leaps across a towering cliff, determined to reach the center of the disturbance. He soon arrives at an enormous whirlpool of blue energy swirling within an open clearing. Trying to peer through the dazzling light, he complains to himself that everything is too bright to see clearly. As he continues watching, he finally notices the silhouette of someone trapped inside the magical vortex. Without a moment's hesitation, he throws himself from a great height directly into the enormous sphere of water. Stretching out his arm with all his strength, he reaches through the raging magical currents and firmly grabs the trapped victim. Moments later, the cloaked young man lands gracefully on the grass, successfully rescuing the drowning warrior. Soaked from head to toe, he quickly scans the clearing to make sure no one witnessed what he had just done. Breathing heavily, the young hero lowers his head in frustration, wondering whether he has already lost the trail he had been following. Standing at the edge of the cliff, he quietly gazes toward the distant mountains where the massive pillar of blue light still shines. His eyes glow with determination as he realizes the terrifying scale of the Imperial family's magical power. Back at the hunting grounds, Talon stands frozen in place, tears streaming down his face as he quietly whispers his master's name. He remains motionless while the surrounding nobles murmur among themselves about the Duke's tragic fate. The Emperor calmly declares that the matter has come to an end. One of his attendants announces that the official closing ceremony of the royal hunt will begin at noon. As the crowd slowly disperses across the valley, servants begin preparing the grand stage for the final awards. Meanwhile, the first prince brushes the dust from his uniform with a look of contempt. Satisfied with what he believes is the elimination of a worthless rebel, he arrogantly walks past the kneeling knights, declaring that only strict discipline can keep fools from forgetting their place. The gathered nobles openly mock the downfall of the duke's family, while Talon stands with his head lowered, silently enduring their insults. One by one, the knights and aristocrats leave the courtyard, abandoning the injured young man in the middle of the arena. With heavy steps, Talon slowly returns to the camp, crushed by the grief of losing both his master and his closest companion. As he walks, one of the soldiers spits at him, calling him a filthy traitor, while the others burst into laughter at his misery. Hidden among the crowd, the seventh prince quietly watches the scene, knowing that Talon's heart has been completely shattered. The young assistant silently enters his tent, while the prince thinks to himself that Talon is not the type of person to remain broken forever. Inside, Talon begins gathering the shattered pieces of his wooden bed, trying to restore some order to the now empty tent. As he cleans, his eyes fall upon a small sealed letter lying on the ground. Picking it up with trembling hands, he is shocked to recognize his family's official crest stamped on the seal. The letter begins by saying that if Talon is reading it, then the Duke has most likely already departed from this world. In the message, the old warrior earnestly asks Talon to take good care of his young son after his death. He admits that he senses he is about to commit a grave mistake and asks his loyal aide to remember one important thing above all else. Fighting back tears, Talon reads the words that his master wanted him to hear most. None of this is your fault. His body trembles as he reaches the final section of the letter. The Duke officially appoints Talon as the temporary head of the family until his heir is ready. The letter slips from his hands and gently falls onto the floor. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Talon collapses to his knees and quietly breaks down in tears. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the black-haired prince casually remarks that his blonde brother exhausted far too much mana during the royal hunt. The young man calmly warns that the mysterious illness has worsened considerably since the tournament. The blonde crown prince suddenly coughs up blood and furiously orders him to stay silent. Holding up the mysterious black stone, he demands an honest explanation and threatens to kill his younger brother if everything turns out to be nothing more than a trick. Remaining perfectly composed, the protagonist advises him to use his mana sparingly, warning that overexertion will only accelerate the disease. The blonde prince silently burns with hatred, swearing that once he fully recovers, he will personally tear his younger brother apart. Watching him with a faint smile, the protagonist reminds him that the only reason he is still alive is because the black stone is continuously purifying the corrupted mana inside his body. After leaving the room, the prince becomes concerned by reports claiming that Talon has fallen into a deep coma in the medical camp. He quietly wonders whether the young man's life is truly in danger. At that moment, Talon slowly opens his eyes. Confused, he stares at the unfamiliar ceiling above him, trying to understand where he is. A servant approaches to help him sit up, but the bespectacled young man firmly tells him to step aside. The servant explains that Talon has been unconscious for 2 weeks and could collapse again at any moment. Ignoring the warning, Talon insists that he must see the young duke immediately. He then asks about the current state of the family. The servant sadly explains that their situation is dire. Most of their business partners have abandoned them, many servants have resigned, and the family's finances are rapidly collapsing. Because of the duke's alleged treason, no one dares offer them assistance. As they walk through the mansion, the young duke notices Talon approaching despite his weakened condition. The boy rushes toward him in relief, asking whether he is all right. Talon apologizes for causing everyone so much worry. The young duke sadly explains that countless problems have piled up, and they have not even been able to arrange his father's funeral. As they continue walking, Talon overhears 2 men gossiping outside through an open window. They whisper that the Duke lost his mind and suggest leaving before they are branded traitors as well. Hearing those words, Talon quietly realizes that the stain of treason may never disappear from the family's name. He calmly calls one of the servants over. The man immediately bows and awaits his orders. With an icy expression, Talon commands him to tear out the tongues of the men spreading those rumors. His cold gaze leaves no room for doubt as he asks whether he really needs to repeat such a simple order. Intimidated by the temporary leader's ruthless demeanor, the servant bows deeply and accepts the command. To everyone's astonishment, Talon then announces that the Duke's funeral will not take place. He explains that the deceased can no longer be publicly acknowledged as a member of the family. The young Duke is stunned and asks why such a harsh decision is necessary. Talon reminds himself that he is now the acting head of the family. He knows it is his responsibility to protect the household until the young heir is old enough to take his rightful place. With a solemn expression, the young man slowly removes his glasses, signaling that he has made a firm decision. A cold, merciless look appears in Talon's eyes as he declares that he will use any method necessary to keep everyone safe. The scene shifts to an elegant chamber where an unlit fireplace dominates the main wall. Suddenly, an enraged scream echoes throughout the room as furniture is hurled across the floor and smashed to pieces. The destruction continues, with priceless decorations and luxurious objects shattering one after another. Standing before the massive window, the blonde prince breathes heavily while staring at the wreckage surrounding him. Filled with rage, he curses the fact that he is trapped there as a frightened maid listens from outside the room. His eyes burn with fury as he vows to destroy his enemy. Then he recalls the arrangement they made for the following day. He remembers agreeing to pretend that he would enter the imperial forest without actually going inside. In that memory, he questions why he should take part in such a ridiculous plan. The black-haired young man calmly explains that he has important business in the forest. He adds that he does not want anyone to know where he is going, and the blonde prince's presence will ensure that no one becomes suspicious. Annoyed, the blonde prince demands to know what his brother is secretly planning and why he insists on going there alone. The young man answers mysteriously that it is part of his treatment and advises his brother to remain in his room and wait. Unable to control his anger, the blonde prince lunges forward and violently slams the protagonist against the wall. He accuses his brother of acting as though he is indispensable and insists that he could simply seek help from the imperial mages instead. Grabbing the young man's throat, he declares that his patience has run out and threatens to kill him on the spot. Even while being strangled, the protagonist smiles with blood trickling from his mouth and sarcastically tells him to go ahead. He calmly reveals that using that mysterious power has drastically shortened the blonde prince's lifespan. The blonde prince suddenly coughs up a large amount of blood as unbearable pain surges through his body. The protagonist frees himself and warns that interrupting the treatment will leave him paralyzed for an entire week. He then asks whether the prince has ever wondered how everyone would react after witnessing his downfall. Still kneeling in a pool of his own blood, the blonde prince wonders which member of the royal family would even bother trying to save him. The young man coldly explains that if the treatment fails, another heir will inherit the throne, making the prince even more furious. With a chilling expression, the protagonist tells him to think carefully if he truly wishes to stay alive. Firmly gripping the blonde prince's chin, he warns that his own patience is also running out. The young man turns toward the exit and remarks that it would be wise for them to stop keeping watch over him because disappearing without leaving any trace is his specialty. As he opens the doors, he advises the blonde prince to abandon these pointless attempts, since they only delay his recovery. Collapsed helplessly on the floor, the defeated blonde prince desperately asks, "What is your real objective?" The protagonist pauses with his back still turned. He quietly repeats the question to himself before finally answering. As a falcon soars through the skies above the imperial forest, his voice calmly reveals that his only goal is to survive. The bird glides toward the brilliant horizon, flying over the endless green forest beneath the warm sunlight. Several dark feathers slowly drift to the ground, showing that the young man has ended his previous transformation. Landing firmly on the grass, he is pleased to discover that he searched the entire forest without finding anyone nearby. He explains that he deliberately cleared the area so he could experiment with his unique transformation ability. He wonders whether he can transform into animals other than the ones he has already used, believing that such an ability could become incredibly powerful. To find the answer, he must first understand its exact limitations and determine how it is activated. Searching through his bag, the young man decides that discovering the activation condition is now his highest priority. He theorizes that physical contact with an animal may be the first requirement, based on his previous transformations. To test this theory, he builds a small wooden trap in the middle of the forest. Determined to capture a small animal and verify his hypothesis, he places fresh, high-quality fruit inside his bait. Before long, A curious little squirrel notices the offering from a nearby tree. Hearing the rustling of leaves, the protagonist quickly turns toward the sound. He spots the tiny squirrel rapidly climbing down the trunk toward the unfinished trap. Realizing it is not even complete yet, the young man wonders whether he can still catch the little creature despite that. A small squirrel calmly climbs down the tree trunk and stares curiously at the young man. Surprised by its fearless behavior, he extends a hand filled with seeds, and the squirrel gently places its tiny paw on his palm. Smiling, he pets the little creature while warning it that being so trusting around strangers in the forest is dangerous. Satisfied that he has made physical contact, he decides it's finally time to test his new ability. Closing his eyes, the young man focuses all of his concentration on transforming into the squirrel. A bright yellow aura suddenly envelops his body as the transformation begins. Just as quickly as it appears, the light fades away. He opens his eyes in confusion, only to realize that absolutely nothing has changed. Thinking carefully, he wonders whether his transformations depend not only on physical contact but also on his state of mind. Perhaps his desperate desire to escape or flee is the real trigger. Trying another approach, he imagines himself as a squirrel, focusing on the instinctive urge to climb trees. Before he can continue experimenting, the little squirrel suddenly bites the strap of his leather bag and bolts away with it. The young man freezes in disbelief before frantically chasing after the tiny thief, shouting for it to give back his belongings. After a frantic pursuit, he finally grabs the end of the bag's strap. The squirrel refuses to let go, pulling upward with unbelievable strength as it scrambles toward the massive tree. An absurd tug-of-war begins between the prince and the tiny rodent. To his horror, the leather strap begins to tear under the strain. A loud crash echoes through the forest moments later, startling flocks of birds into the sky. That evening, peace returns to the imperial palace. A maid timidly knocks on the prince's door and announces that dinner is ready. He calmly tells her to enter. Praying that the prince is in a good mood today, she slowly steps inside. The moment she sees his filthy clothes, panic spreads across her face. The prince quickly reassures her, while silently feeling relieved that she hadn't arrived a moment earlier when he had returned in the form of a crow. He sighs inwardly, disappointed that he still hasn't discovered the secret behind his transformations and that he wasted the entire day chasing a squirrel. The maid studies him nervously, sensing that something very unusual is happening. The prince simply orders her to bring him a fresh set of clothes. Although she agrees, she hesitates with a troubled expression. Confused, the black-haired prince asks why she looks so nervous. With trembling hands, she points toward his leather bag and quietly asks if he really brought a squirrel back with him. He looks down in shock. To his disbelief, the shameless little squirrel is hiding inside his bag. The mischievous creature suddenly leaps out and dashes around the luxurious room while the prince desperately chases after it. Terrified that he intends to kill the animal, the maid pleads with him to spare its life and offers to release it outside the palace herself. Ignoring her request, the prince sternly repeats his earlier command for her to fetch his clean clothes. Growing impatient, he raises his voice and demands that she leave immediately and return with the garments. Frightened by his outburst, the young maid sprints through the palace corridors. As she runs, she silently vows to return as quickly as possible so she can rescue the poor squirrel before it's too late. Clutching the clean clothes tightly, she rushes around a corner and suddenly crashes into someone. She slowly raises her head in terror. Standing before her is the feared first princess. The elegant blonde noblewoman recognizes Rand's personal maid and asks why she is in such a hurry. The frightened girl immediately throws herself to the floor and begs for mercy. The princess glances at the folded clothes in her hands and coldly asks where they came from. She accuses the maid of stealing imperial property. Desperately, the maid denies the accusation and swears in the name of the great hero that she is telling the truth. She explains that the seventh prince dirtied his clothes while walking through the palace garden. The princess calmly extends her hand toward the trembling servant. In a cold voice, she says that it makes no difference whether the story is true or false, because lying to her is impossible. Activating her unique magic, the first princess verifies whether the servant is telling the truth. Her eyes begin to glow with an intense light. Almost immediately, she realizes something is terribly wrong. Through her ability, she discovers that the prince was never in the garden, despite the maid's claim. Instead, she uncovers the truth. Her younger brother had secretly been conducting business deep within the imperial forest. Back in his room, the protagonist quietly thinks about his next move. Looking at the squirrel, he explains that the royal palace is no place for a wild animal and insists that he has no intention of adopting it. He stretches out his arms, offering to carry the squirrel back to the forest, and politely asks it to cooperate. The squirrel immediately takes a defensive stance and begins squeaking loudly, refusing every command. Annoyed, The young man grumbles that allowing a wild squirrel to roam freely through the imperial palace makes no sense. The constant scratching and squeaking remind him of his previous life on Earth, when rats used to scratch inside the walls of his tiny apartment. Already frustrated by how unpredictable his new life has become, he lunges forward in one final attempt to catch the little rodent. This time, he succeeds. Proud of himself, he tells the squirrel to behave and quietly climb into his travel bag. Instead, the wild creature sinks its teeth into his hand. The prince cries out in pain and immediately jerks his hand away. Furious, he glares at the squirrel and demands to know how it dares bite a member of the imperial family. The nimble little animal leaps away and quickly climbs the massive pillar in the center of the room, reaching the highest point of the ceiling. Looking up in disbelief, the prince realizes there's no chance of catching it. Even if he climbs up there, the squirrel will simply escape somewhere else. Closing his eyes, he mutters that everything would be much easier if he could transform into a squirrel himself. Suddenly, a familiar surge of magical energy courses through his body. His eyes snap open as brilliant golden light radiates from his chest. For a moment, he stares in disbelief. Had he finally figured it out? The golden aura completely envelops him as his body begins to shrink and transform. Moments later, the transformation is complete. Now, in the form of a small squirrel, the protagonist smiles triumphantly. He has finally uncovered the secret behind his mysterious ability. At that exact moment, the wild squirrel loses its footing high above and tumbles toward the floor. Without thinking, the transformed prince leaps into the air and catches the falling squirrel, cushioning its landing. Just then, the door suddenly swings open. Ignoring Anna's attempts to stop her, the first princess enters the room without warning. She casually criticizes the palace servants as she walks through the luxurious chamber. Halfway across the marble floor, however, she suddenly stops. Right in front of her, she sees an unbelievable sight. A tiny squirrel is gently holding another squirrel in its arms as if comforting it. The princess stares in stunned disbelief. Meanwhile, Anna is so overwhelmed by the adorable scene that she struggles not to burst into tears. Still trapped in his squirrel form, the protagonist can only sigh inwardly. This situation has become completely ridiculous. The following morning, bright sunlight bathes the white towers of the imperial palace. Back in his room, the young man gently pets the squirrel resting on the table, amused by how plump and well-fed it has become. He notices that ever since he saved it from falling, the little creature refuses to leave his side. Perhaps it is grateful for the rescue. Even so, he warns the squirrel to stay hidden inside the room and avoid attracting the attention of the palace guards. At least the day's experiments have finally paid off. He has discovered the bizarre condition required to activate his transformations. Reviewing everything carefully, he recalls every creature he has successfully transformed into so far. The crow, the black horse, and now, the squirrel. After thinking it through, he realizes that all of them shared one crucial detail. Before every successful transformation, he had touched the back of the animal's neck. That precise point is the true trigger for his ability. With one mystery solved, his thoughts return to a much greater concern. The first princess. She is far more dangerous than the novel ever described. He remembers the terrifying expression on her face during their last encounter, completely different from the calm and elegant woman portrayed in the book. Fortunately, Anna managed to save the situation by claiming that the heroic squirrel was simply the prince's pet. After secretly returning to his human form in the courtyard, he slipped back into his room, believing the matter had ended peacefully. As she prepared to leave, however, the princess calmly remarked that his choice of a pet was unusual. Then, just before walking out the door, she stopped. With an enigmatic smile, she ordered her younger brother to meet her the following morning. She added that they had several important matters that needed to be discussed. The young man sits quietly in his room, wondering why the first princess suddenly wishes to speak with him. A troubling thought crosses his mind as she somehow discovered that he is actually a reincarnated soul. With no way to refuse a royal summons, he accepts his fate and passes the time playing with the squirrel, which continues happily munching on its food. Soon, the seventh prince arrives at the appointed location. A knight in shining armor respectfully bows and welcomes him inside. The prince is immediately impressed by the enormous golden doors leading to the first princess's private chambers. As he enters the lavish hall, he finds the princess sitting gracefully on an elegant sofa. She politely offers him a seat, but he declines, preferring to get straight to the point. Her expression instantly turns cold. She quietly asks whether he truly failed to hear her order to sit down. Overwhelmed by her commanding presence, the young man quickly apologizes for his lack of manners. The princess smiles gently and says she understands. After all, his curiosity has always made him impatient. Even so, she studies him carefully. She cannot understand how her timid younger brother suddenly became bold enough to venture alone into the imperial forest. The prince remains tense, knowing that this perceptive woman is the one person he fears facing the most. Unlike the other members of the imperial family, whose mana manifests through natural elements such as the emperor's fire or the first prince's water, the first princess possesses something far more terrifying. Her mana governs humanity itself. It grants her the frightening ability to read people's minds and even manipulate them. Fixing him with a dark gaze, she quietly says that she hopes he is being honest, because nothing saddens her more than being lied to by her own family. She gently places a hand on his head. The young man forces himself to remain calm. He already knows her mind-reading ability isn't affecting him. If it were working, she would have already taken control of his thoughts and extracted every answer she wanted. According to the novel, her power has one important limitation. It cannot affect someone who shares both a blood relationship and genuine familial love with her. The blood relation is obvious. The real mystery is the second condition. He knows he could never genuinely love the woman standing before him. So why is her power failing? Unable to understand the reason, he grows increasingly anxious as the princess demands that he answer her questions without hesitation. Far away from the palace, the scene shifts to a hidden cave concealed behind a massive waterfall. Inside the damp cavern, droplets of water slowly fall from the sharp stone stalactites hanging overhead. One shining drop forms at the tip of a rock before falling into the darkness below. It lands directly on the face of an elderly man lying motionless on the cave floor. The old duke slowly opens his eyes. His face is worn with age and covered in countless scars earned through years of battle. Groaning in pain, he struggles to breathe and slowly attempts to move his arms. Holding his aching head, he wonders where he is. A calm voice suddenly echoes through the cave. "You survived." Startled, the duke looks toward the speaker. A mysterious figure dressed in a black hood stands silently nearby. The old warrior demands to know who saved him. The hooded young man calmly replies that he honestly expected the duke to have died before waking up. Without another word, the stranger grips the hilt of his sword and slowly draws the gleaming blade. He points it directly at the duke's throat. In a cold voice, he says he has only one question. "Are you still loyal to the Empire?" The hooded man warns that the duke's answer will determine whether he lives or dies inside that cave. Ryan remains seated while countless thoughts race through his mind. Manel's ability clearly had no effect on him, yet he couldn't understand why. There had to be a reason. Perhaps it was because he now occupied the body of the seventh prince. After all, the original seventh prince had been such an insignificant figure that the novel barely mentioned him. He had appeared only a few times throughout the entire story. As Ryan tried to sort through his thoughts, Menel looked down at him with her usual cold expression and once again asked why he had changed so drastically. She could tell he was thinking hard and remarked that he seemed unable to come up with an answer. Ryan briefly considered pretending he knew nothing, but he doubted someone like Menel would be fooled so easily. He desperately searched his memories, trying to imagine how the original seventh prince would have responded in this situation. To his surprise, Menel suddenly withdrew her hand, ending her attempt to read his mind. She turned her back to him and calmly stated that if he refused to speak, she would simply use another method. Before Ryan could ask what she meant, Menel summoned the knights waiting outside her chamber. The two guards quickly entered and respectfully bowed before her. With an annoyed sigh, Menel explained that her younger brother refused to cooperate and casually ordered the knights to cut open Ryan's mouth if necessary. The command horrified both men. They immediately objected, insisting they could never carry out such a cruel order against a prince of the imperial family. Both knights dropped to their knees and begged her to reconsider. Meanwhile, Ryan watched everything unfold while doing his best to hide the cold sweat running down his back. Menel had already lost her patience, complaining that the constant noise was becoming irritating. She activated her human mana, and her eyes glowed faintly as her mind control ability took effect. In an instant, the knights lost all resistance. Under her control, they silently drew their swords and pointed them directly at Ryan. Although panic surged through him, Ryan forced himself to remain calm. Menel warned him to choose his next words carefully, making it clear that his fate depended entirely on his answer. Before she could continue, Ryan suddenly spoke. "My mother passed away." The unexpected statement immediately caught Menel off guard. Her expression changed as she turned toward him and demanded an explanation. She questioned how he could possibly know such a thing and asked whether he had secretly remained in contact with his mother all this time. Ryan calmly explained that before leaving, his mother had entrusted him with a necklace containing a beautiful blue gemstone. She had told him that as long as the gem continued to shine, they would meet again someday. However, not long ago, the blue light had slowly faded until the gemstone suddenly turned black and shattered. At that moment, Ryan said he realized that his mother, who had always longed to return to her homeland in the East, had finally found peace there. Hearing his story, Menel's entire demeanor changed. The dangerous aura surrounding her disappeared, replaced by a rare gentleness that softened her expression. Watching her reaction, Ryan silently admitted to himself that every word he had just spoken was a complete lie. Even so, he knew the story was convincing. Among all of the Emperor's consorts, Ryan's mother had been the only one who had successfully escaped the imperial family. The novel never revealed what truly happened to her, although many believed she had returned to her homeland in the East. Others speculated that she fled because she had given birth to a black-haired prince. Whatever the truth might have been, one fact remained certain: she never appeared again, not even by the end of the story. After listening to his explanation, Menel slowly walked toward Ryan. She admitted that she had always believed he resented his biological mother for abandoning him. Ryan replied that he wasn't entirely sure how he felt anymore. When he was younger, he had hated her for leaving him behind. But as the years passed, he often found himself staring toward the eastern sky every night while absent-mindedly holding the necklace she had left him. Ryan took the necklace out and gently placed it on the table. Quietly, he said that perhaps he had been missing her all along. Hearing this, Menel asked whether those feelings had changed the way he viewed the rest of his family. Ryan reflected that it was strange how years of resentment could turn into longing in a single moment. Perhaps, he said, that was simply what family meant. Menel remained silent for a brief moment as she carefully studied him. Then, without saying another word, she ordered the knights to sheath their swords and wait outside. Still, under the effects of her mind control ability, they obeyed immediately. Before dismissing them, Menel commanded the knights to erase everything that had happened inside the room from their memories. Once they were gone, Ryan silently wondered whether his lie had truly worked. He received his answer almost immediately. Menel stepped closer and gently held his hands, telling him that he must have suffered greatly all this time. At that moment, Ryan realized his deception had succeeded. However, her very next words immediately irritated him. Ryan remained silent as Menel reminded him that, even if he was the black-haired failure, he was still her younger brother. He couldn't help wondering whether she truly cared about him, or if she was simply playing another game. Since Menel possessed the ability to control almost anyone with her mind, it was only natural that she became suspicious when her absolute power suddenly failed. Besides, the original seventh prince had never shared a close relationship with her. Even so, Ryan's deception had successfully diffused the situation. Ironically, the necklace that had touched Menel so deeply was nothing more than a cheap trinket Ryan had picked up by chance. His thoughts soon shifted to Duke Freyhus. According to the original story, the Duke was supposed to fall into the valley and lose both of his legs. Ryan wondered whether he had already crossed paths with the protagonist or if events had somehow changed. Surely someone as important as Duke Freyhus couldn't have died so easily. Meanwhile, inside a cave hidden behind a waterfall, Duke Freyhus groaned in pain while clutching his badly broken right leg. The mysterious boy standing before him calmly warned him not to move, explaining that the injury was a severe fracture. Realizing he was both wounded and unarmed, the Duke quickly assessed his situation. Escape was impossible in his current condition. Even in the dimly lit cave, he could tell the boy was exceptionally skilled. His posture was flawless, and the sword aimed at him radiated overwhelming precision. A single glance was enough to tell that this was no ordinary child. As the blade moved even closer, the Duke hurriedly asked the boy to lower his weapon and explain what was happening. The boy eventually lowered the sword and revealed that several days earlier, he had witnessed an enormous sphere of water flying across the sky. He had tried to chase it, but it traveled far too quickly. Judging by the speed of its impact, he had assumed that whoever was trapped inside had died instantly. The moment he heard that, the Duke realized the boy was talking about the execution carried out by the first princess. Confused, the Duke wondered how he had managed to survive at all. He suddenly remembered the mysterious stone pouch he had been carrying and suspected it might have protected him somehow, although it had disappeared during the fall. It was most likely lost somewhere along the way. Without warning, the boy raised his sword again. He explained that while searching the surrounding area, he had discovered an old man covered in blood inside a nearby cave. In the next instant, he drove the sword into the stone wall only inches from the Duke's face. Staring at him with icy eyes, the boy asked, in the name of the god, Amika, whether the Duke was loyal to the Aberrant Empire. The moment he heard that name, Duke Freyhus immediately understood who stood before him. Of all the people he could have encountered in his current state, it had to be a heretic. Memories suddenly flooded his mind: dead children discarded like garbage, starving refugees abandoned by the Empire, and Ryan's harsh words condemning the Imperial Knights as nothing more than loyal dogs who blindly obeyed their masters without question. He also remembered his beloved son, Flynn, whom he had always hoped would inherit his ideals and one day become the Empire's sword, eliminating every heretic in its name. Returning to reality, Duke Freya slowly closed his eyes and let out a long, weary sigh. When he opened them again, an unfamiliar anger burned within them. "I know nothing about loyalty to the Aberrant Empire," he declared. He claimed he was nothing more than a frail old man who had carelessly lost his footing while wandering through the mountains. Some time later, Duke Freyhus had recovered enough to walk on his own, although his injured left ankle remained tied with a rope. With a helpless sigh, he thanked Rattel for treating his injured leg before politely asking him to untie the rope. He explained that dragging it while walking was difficult, and at his age, even a small fall could cause serious injuries. If he got hurt again, Rattle would only end up dragging him anyway. Rattle answered with an immediate and emotionless refusal. The Duke tried to persuade him once more, but the boy simply glanced back before continuing forward. Without another word, he gave the rope a hard pull, nearly causing Duke Freyhus to lose his balance. Barely managing to stay on his feet, the Duke realized that Rattle had absolutely no intention of listening to him. As they ventured deeper into the cave, Duke Freyhus quietly examined his surroundings. He found it difficult to believe that such an enormous cave could exist so close to the Imperial Forest without ever being discovered. Earlier, Rattle had mentioned Amica, the deity worshipped by the heretics who were believed to have been completely eradicated more than 50 years ago. Could they really have been hiding here all this time? The Duke began piecing together his memories from before he had lost consciousness. He believed he had been thrown somewhere west of the forest's central tower, or perhaps to the southwest. If he somehow escaped, he could determine the cave's exact location and later return with reinforcements. His thoughts suddenly came to a stop as he realized how absurd they sounded. Even after everything that had happened, he was still thinking like the commander of the Imperial Knights. With a bitter sigh, he questioned why someone branded as a traitor remained so devoted to the Empire. After they had walked in silence for some time, Rattle suddenly asked the old man for his name. The Duke introduced himself as Agony Freyhus. Hearing the answer, Rattle rested one hand against the cave wall and admitted that he had been genuinely surprised when he first found him. According to Rattle, the cave was protected by a divine blessing. It was a sacred place that outsiders could never enter by their own will, especially someone from the Aberrant Empire. As he finished speaking, Rattel thrust his sword into the stone wall. Instantly, countless glowing golden symbols spread across the stone, flowing from the cave walls into the blade like streams of radiant light. Ryan watched in complete disbelief as Duke Freyhus stared silently at the impossible sight before him. The massive stone wall trembled before slowly splitting apart. As the brilliant light faded, a hidden world was revealed beyond the wall. An enormous and magnificent palace stood inside the mountain, perfectly concealed from the outside world. Seeing the Duke's astonishment, Rattle calmly explained that there were only two possible reasons he had been able to enter this sacred place. Either he was an agent of the Aberrant Empire, sent to destroy them, or he had been led there by the will of the goddess, Amica, herself. Whichever explanation was true, Rattel welcomed Agony Freyhus to the domain of Amica. The scene then shifted to Rasha, who was once again receiving his treatment. Meanwhile, Ryan relaxed on a nearby sofa while quietly organizing his thoughts. Since the timeline had already begun moving faster than expected, Ryan believed it was only natural that both Duke Freyhus and the story's protagonist would also begin advancing earlier than in the original novel. With a little luck, news about the protagonist would eventually reach him. Ryan even felt a slight sense of guilt for dragging Duke Freyhus into so much unnecessary suffering. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when Rasha slammed his hand onto the table in frustration, complaining that today's medicine wasn't enough. He demanded a larger dose so he could recover more quickly. Ryan looked at him coldly and calmly asked whether he had just shouted at him. Rasha immediately denied it, insisting that he was only frustrated by how slowly the treatment was progressing. Ryan reminded him once again that trying to speed up the process would only ruin his body and advised him to remain patient. Still unwilling to give up, Rasha asked whether there was a faster method, even if it carried greater risks than giving up the hookah. Ryan looked at him with a puzzled expression and asked what he meant. Rasha reminded him that the first time Ryan had barged into his room, he had told him to quit smoking the hookah if he truly cared about his health. Ryan simply smiled and replied that quitting would only benefit him anyway. Annoyed by the answer, Rasha cursed under his breath before storming out of the room. Watching him leave, Ryan silently reflected on how badly Rasha's lifestyle was destroying his body. The hookah, the wine sitting nearby, and even the food he ate every day had all become poisoned because of the mysterious seed growing inside him. Unless that seed was removed, Rasha would remain dependent on Ryan's treatment for the rest of his life. Pushing those thoughts aside, Ryan announced that today's treatment was over since they still needed to attend the evening ritual. During the ceremony, Rasha placed his hand on the ceremonial platform, and everyone immediately noticed that his mana had increased dramatically compared to before. The other princes openly praised his remarkable progress, while their father concluded the ritual after seeing that no one else wished to step forward. As the imperial family gradually left the hall, Ryan deliberately remained seated. He preferred leaving last to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Just then, the eighth prince, Silos, walked over, grabbed Ryan by the head, and mockingly called him a black-haired outcast. He questioned why Ryan was still sitting there after the ritual had ended before insulting the mother who had supposedly abandoned him during childhood. Ryan silently endured every insult, thinking that one day he would have to teach the rude prince a proper lesson. Before the confrontation could escalate any further, Manel suddenly appeared behind them. Calmly, she addressed Ryan and remarked that he had seemed unusually gloomy throughout the ritual. Silos immediately froze, mistakenly believing the first princess was speaking to him. Ryan respectfully greeted Menel as she approached. She asked whether he was feeling unwell. Ryan casually replied that he was perfectly fine and simply found the ceremony rather boring, never once acknowledging Selos's presence. Menel gently reminded him that, whether he found it entertaining or not, the imperial ritual was an important tradition and that he should avoid making his boredom so obvious. After offering a brief farewell, she quietly walked away. Selos stood there in complete disbelief. The first princess had ignored him entirely while speaking only to Ryan. The moment Menel disappeared, Selos grabbed Ryan by the collar and demanded to know why someone like the first princess would show concern for him. Ryan simply sighed to himself, feeling that his life was becoming more troublesome with every passing day. Before Selos could continue, another hand landed firmly on his shoulder. He turned around in alarm and found Rasha standing behind him. Looking at Selos with a calm yet intimidating expression, Rasha asked whether he had a problem with Ryan. It was the second time that day Selos had been completely terrified. Ryan, however, remained perfectly calm. He casually told Rasha that it was nothing more than a harmless exchange between younger brothers, showing not the slightest concern for Selos. After straightening his clothes, Ryan politely excused himself, remarking that Rasha was probably busy as well. With that, he quietly walked away. Rasha then left the hall together with the second prince, Dido, while Selos remained standing in place, unable to process everything that had just happened. As the two princes walked through the palace corridors, Dido mentioned an interesting piece of news. He explained that Tolan, the former disciple of Duke Freyhus, appeared to be plotting something within the central territory belonging to the Freyhus family. Rasha showed little interest, dismissing Tolan and his followers as insignificant insects. In his opinion, the Freyhus family had only 1 year left before their lands legally returned to the imperial family, making any resistance completely meaningless. However, Dido smiled mischievously and remarked that there was no need to wait an entire year. His words finally caught Rasha's attention. With a cruel smile, Dido claimed he already had the perfect plan and asked whether Rasha wanted to hear it. Meanwhile, Selos finally snapped out of his daze. He slammed Ryan against a nearby wall and demanded to know who he really was. Ryan calmly looked back at him before sarcastically introducing himself as the seventh prince, Ryan Aberin. Frustrated by the answer, Selos ignited a small flame in his hand and demanded the truth. He couldn't understand why both the first prince and the first princess had suddenly taken an interest in someone they had always ignored. Threatening to burn Ryan to ashes unless he confessed everything, Selos tried to intimidate him. Ryan, however, remained completely unfazed. Instead, he casually pointed out that the tiny amount of mana Selos had gathered was barely enough to light an oil lamp, let alone burn someone alive. If you actually tried, Ryan said calmly, it would take so long that someone else would discover us before you even finished. The blunt remark immediately shocked Selos, causing him to instinctively lower the flame. His voice trembled as he demanded to know how Ryan had figured it out. Ryan stepped closer and, in a calm yet commanding tone, replied, "If you truly want to keep your weakness a secret, the first thing you should do is stop speaking so disrespectfully to your older brother." Inside a dark torture chamber, a prisoner is bound to a blood-soaked wooden table while metal restraints force his mouth open. His muffled screams echo through the room as the relentless interrogation continues without mercy. The flickering firelight casts his twisted shadow across the stone wall, while the only sounds that break the silence are his labored breaths. Elsewhere, a framed portrait of an elderly gray-haired nobleman dressed in formal military attire hangs peacefully on the wall. His stern expression remains frozen until a sword suddenly slices through the painting, splitting it apart with a single violent strike. The destruction continues as books, armor, and treasured possessions are thrown onto an ever-growing pile of debris. A voice announces that the man once known as Duke Fetus is, from this day forward, to be regarded as though he never existed. A burning torch is lowered onto the pile. There will be no funeral, no grave, and no memorial to preserve his name. The only thing that may keep his memory alive is the remembrance of those who refuse to forget him. The belongings are consumed by flames before a gathered crowd. An official warns everyone present that anyone caught honoring the former duke's memory will face severe punishment. Later, someone pounds urgently on the doors of the estate. A voice announces that a report has been prepared for the acting head of the family. The messenger is Jack, commander of the Fetus Knights, a battle-hardened veteran with graying hair and a weathered face. Jack reports that, following orders, his men arrested those spreading false rumors within the Second Night Order. The offenders were punished by having their wrists severed before being expelled from service. Clearly exhausted, Jack wipes his face with one hand after delivering his report. The acting head, a young man with blue hair and round glasses, remarks that Jack appears exhausted. Jack apologizes, explaining that the household is suffering from a severe shortage of staff, forcing him to work throughout the night. Without lifting his eyes from the documents on his desk, the acting head briefly acknowledges his efforts. Jack places a scroll on the desk containing the requested list of deserters. He explains that security has been reinforced to prevent further desertions, but nearly half of their forces have already abandoned the household. As the acting head silently reads the report, he reflects that even the families who had served the fetus household for generations have now severed their ties. If discipline among those who remain begins to crumble, the family's downfall will be inevitable. After a brief hesitation, Jack cautiously raises another concern. He wonders whether erasing every trace of Duke Fetus has gone too far and whether doing so might provoke the knights who still remain loyal to their former lord. The acting head coldly asks whether Jack still believes Duke Fetus deserves to be recognized as the head of the family. Startled, Jack immediately apologizes. He admits that he also struggled to accept what the Duke had become. His thoughts drift back to the man's tragic downfall. He still cannot understand how someone once so honorable could end in such disgrace, or how a man known for unwavering loyalty could have committed such unforgivable acts. As Jack studies the acting head's face, he cannot shake the feeling that he is looking at a completely different person from the one he once served. Meanwhile, the acting head quietly wonders how much the old knight has changed and whether those changes were born from the pain of feeling betrayed by the duke he had once followed without hesitation. A hand presses firmly against a desk covered with handwritten documents as someone announces that it is time to leave. Jack and the acting head walk side by side across a stone courtyard, following two guards marching ahead of them. Their synchronized footsteps echo across the grounds as they make their way toward the estate's central assembly area. Near the staircase outside, an aide informs the acting head that everything has been prepared for the upcoming speech. The acting head simply nods in acknowledgement before continuing down the stone steps with calm, deliberate strides until he reaches the courtyard below. Standing before the grand estate alongside Jack and the aide, he faces a large gathering of servants and staff. As they wait, whispers spread through the crowd. Some quietly wonder why everyone has been summoned, while others whisper that several kitchen workers had their tongues cut out the previous day after speaking carelessly. They question how anyone could continue living under such terrifying conditions. Farther back, several hooded guards quietly discuss the situation among themselves. They suspect the brutal punishments are driven by fear that the household will be forever branded as a family of traitors. One guard nervously suggests that they should escape before it is too late. Nearby, the bespectacled aide overhears the fearful conversation. He silently worries about what would happen if anyone were caught trying to flee in secret. Letting out a quiet breath, he feels a moment of relief when he realizes that no one has noticed his own anxiety. Standing atop the platform, the acting head addresses everyone gathered before him. He declares that House Fetus has faithfully served the Sierra Empire since its founding. For more than 1,000 years, the family has stood beside the imperial family as its most trusted protector. However, he admits that recent events have thrown the household into chaos, and everyone already knows the reason why. He then speaks the name aloud. Duke Fetus. Jack and the aide standing beside him visibly flinch in shock upon hearing the name spoken so openly before the crowd. The acting head continues, stating that Duke Fetus betrayed the imperial family and was executed for treason. That single act, he says, has shaken the wealth, unity, and honor that House Fetus spent over 1,000 years building. Looking across the crowd, he acknowledges that many people now question the loyalty of House Fetus. Because of that, he offers everyone a final opportunity. Anyone who wishes to leave the household may do so today. Even those whose contracts have years remaining will be released without punishment if they choose to depart. However, he asks them to remember one thing before making their decision. A young servant looks up toward the balcony and calls out that House Fetus still has someone who will uphold its 1,000-year oath. He proudly declares that, until the young lord, Flynn Fetus, inherits the title of Duke, The acting head will continue proving the family's loyalty to the empire and the imperial family. Above them, a white banner bearing the crest of House Fetus snaps loudly in the wind. The acting head resumes his speech, firmly warning that anyone who abandons their loyalty to House Fetus will receive no mercy. He tells everyone to remember those words well. The servants and staff exchange uneasy glances as they listen. Standing off to one side, Jack is startled by the severity of the warning. Although he privately feels the acting head's words sound somewhat threatening, he ultimately agrees that Lord Tullen is justified in speaking so firmly. Meanwhile, the young servant continues speaking to those below. He insists that House Fetus still has a rightful heir, meaning there are still countless opportunities to demonstrate their loyalty to His Majesty and the Empire. Watching from above, the acting head quietly reflects that the more firmly the boy helps stabilize the household, the sooner House Fetus will recover its former strength. Later, back inside the estate, a maid playfully teases Lord Tullen after he stumbles back in surprise. She quietly admits to herself that the only thing she would truly miss is seeing him become flustered whenever the servants teased him. Jack congratulates Lord Tullen on handling the speech well before asking whether the temple has responded to their request for a meeting. Lord Tullen explains that after the recent incident, the temple announced it would no longer grant audiences to anyone from House Fetus. Adjusting his tie, he admits he had expected that response. After thinking for a moment, he gives a new order. The next request should include a particular item, and the temple should be informed that they will not regret examining it. Left alone with his thoughts, he silently addresses the late Duke Fetus. He admits that he still cannot understand what the Duke's true intentions were. As a convoy of carriages travels along a country road, he wonders whether the homeless people living in the slums surrounding the temple truly meant that much to the late Duke. Inside one of the carriages, he continues writing while reflecting that he may never learn the Duke's real motives. Even so, one conviction remains unshaken. He refuses to let the Duke's death become meaningless. As the carriage rolls steadily down the road, he silently asks the late Duke to watch over the land he left behind and witness what it will become. Wherever the Duke now rests, he hopes he will continue watching over them. Eventually, the carriage comes to a halt. Someone asks if they have finally arrived. Stepping outside, Lord Tullen gazes up at the enormous temple before him and remarks on its breathtaking grandeur. Although he has been given only a single year, he notices an enormous crowd already gathered outside the city. Adjusting his glasses with quiet determination, he vows that, even if it costs him everything, he will never allow events to unfold according to the First Prince's plans. Elsewhere, two golden-haired members of the imperial family observe the massive crowd from a balcony. One comments with disgust about the overwhelming number of people gathered below, while the other casually suggests that most are simply curious because this is the first official appearance of House Fetus' new acting head. The First Prince sneers, saying that whenever he sees crowds of insects gathering together like this, he feels an irresistible urge to crush them beneath his feet. Elsewhere, deep within a forest, a young man walks through a clearing covered with fallen leaves. Looking around, he mutters that this should be the section inhabited by medium-sized beasts. A small squirrel sits comfortably on his shoulder as he confidently remarks that he has already captured enough small animals, including foxes and rodents. Now, he wonders whether it is finally time to hunt larger prey. He gently lifts the squirrel from his shoulder and playfully scolds it for secretly following him again. He explains that this area of the forest is far more dangerous than the region inhabited by smaller animals. The squirrel squeaks in protest, but he carefully places it inside his bag. He tells the little creature that if something dangerous appears, protecting it would become impossible. For today, at least, it must stay hidden and avoid following him any farther. Then he finally finds the animal he was looking for. A man sprinted across the rain-soaked forest floor, his legs pounding through the wet grass as he fled in absolute terror. Behind him, a gigantic wolf crashed through the undergrowth with its jaws wide open, sharp fangs glistening as it rapidly closed the gap. In his arms, he tightly held a frightened little squirrel, refusing to let it go. He angrily demanded to know why the tiny creature had decided to provoke the wolf in the first place. The squirrel could only respond with helpless squeaks of protest. Only a few minutes earlier, the situation had been completely different. The wolf had appeared calm and harmless, and all he had needed to do was pat the back of its neck before quietly slipping away. He had even spoken to it gently as though it were a loyal pet. Everything changed the instant the squirrel released a loud, piercing scream. The wolf's peaceful expression disappeared, replaced by overwhelming rage. He immediately scolded the squirrel, asking why it had chosen the worst possible moment to pick a fight with such a monster. He snapped that if the squirrel wanted to throw its life away, it should do it alone instead of dragging him into the disaster. The rain continued pouring as the enormous wolf rushed after them through the forest. Desperately, he searched for a way to escape and wondered which animal he should transform into next. He quickly realized that no land animal could outrun the beast, and there wasn't enough time to become a crow and fly away. Then an impossible thought crossed his mind. If only he could run and fly at the same time. He repeated the wish in frustration, believing it could never happen. To his surprise, his body reacted. The squirrel he had transformed into blinked in confusion and let out a puzzled squeak as a strange change took place. The wolf drew even closer, growling deeply before flashing its deadly teeth, convinced its prey had nowhere left to escape. Then, without warning, he lifted off the ground. He soared into the open sky as sunlight pierced through the clouds above the forest canopy. Moments later, he clung tightly to the side of a rocky cliff, breathing heavily but finally safe from pursuit. Looking at his own reflection in his eye, he understood what had just happened. He had always believed his transformation ability held hidden potential, and now the truth had revealed itself. His power wasn't restricted to taking a single animal form anymore. A winged wolf now flew gracefully through the mountain skies, proving that he could merge different transformations into one powerful form. Elsewhere, several nobles gathered in secret, discussing how Duke Fester had seized control of an entire territory, openly defying the royal family and claiming it for himself. In the crowded streets, people whispered that the Fester family's reputation had completely fallen apart, wondering whether the acting head had finally gone insane, just like others in the family's troubled history. In a nearby village, two men quietly discussed rumors of a hidden treasure buried somewhere close, each hoping to discover it before anyone else. Not far away, two young boys hid in the shadows. One gripped the other's shoulder and declared that it was finally time to test their luck by stealing from unsuspecting passersby. Elsewhere, a hooded man stood among several cloaked companions. As he watched events unfold, he reflected on how quickly the Fester family was heading toward ruin and silently questioned what kind of scheme his ally, Talion, was truly planning. At the grand entrance of the temple, a blue-haired young man wearing glasses stood before the massive structure, while murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. Raising two fingers, he calmly announced that everyone currently occupying the temple grounds had exactly 2 months to leave. Anyone still remaining after that deadline, he declared, would face severe punishment for violating the temple's sacred grounds. One man in the crowd immediately shouted back, demanding to know where they were expected to go if they were forced out, accusing him of condemning them all to die. Nearby, one boy quietly asked his friend what had just been announced. His companion quickly told him to stop asking questions and run while they still had the chance. Several nobles exchanged doubtful glances, surprised that the supposedly kind-hearted acting head of the Fester family was refusing to show mercy. They speculated that he was only acting this way to avoid provoking the royal family. The blue-haired young man looked back at the restless crowd, wondering what had caused such confusion among them. Then a single thought entered his mind. A hospital. He announced that the Fester family intended to build a hospital on that very site. He further explained that they would personally train the displaced people in medicine so they could eventually work there. His announcement left many people bewildered. Voices immediately rose from the crowd, calling the proposal ridiculous and questioning why common people should be learning medicine instead of nobles. Nearby, two noblewomen mocked the entire idea. They sneered that no one in their right mind would choose to study under a family whose reputation had already collapsed, insisting that anyone who did would only be dragged down with them. Meanwhile, a hooded observer quietly walked through town, noting that the Fester family's name had become so disgraced that the chances of the plan succeeding were almost non-existent. The blue-haired man silently admitted that he had placed too much faith in one person's ability to help him. Deciding he could no longer depend on that individual, he prepared to move forward alone. Just then, a powerful voice echoed across the area, demanding to know who had dared laugh at that man. The booming challenge instantly silenced every doubter. An elegant carriage rolled down the street as its driver loudly ordered everyone to move aside. The horses continued forward while pedestrians hurried out of the way. When the carriage finally stopped, all eyes turned toward its door as a distinguished figure stepped out. It was the High Priest. He publicly declared his support for Tolan Krissa, the acting head of House Fester, speaking in the name of God as he made his announcement. The surrounding crowd gasped in disbelief, immediately recognizing the respected religious leader and whispering his title in shock. Tolan immediately knelt before the cathedral, folding his hands respectfully while everyone watched in complete silence. The high priest smiled warmly and extended his hand toward him. Flustered, Tolan quickly stood up and respectfully greeted the high priest. Turning to face the crowd, the high priest addressed everyone as children who were all traveling toward the same destination. He explained that temptation and evil would always exist throughout life's journey. Then he questioned how anyone could claim to be righteous while abandoning others along the way. Among the spectators, a hooded man quietly smiled. He reflected that House Fester's reputation had been forever stained by the sins of a single person, and that stain could never truly be erased. Even so, someone was still choosing to walk the difficult road of redemption. The high priest then raised his hand toward Tolan and offered him a blessing. He prayed that the pitiful child of Aberon, who had chosen the path of atonement, would find fulfillment under God's grace. Deeply moved, Tolan sincerely thanked him for those encouraging words. The high priest simply smiled and dismissed the gratitude, saying he could never ignore a family pursuing such a noble cause. He then suggested they enter the temple together since they were already there and pay their respects to Sierra the Great. Although Tolan expressed his appreciation outwardly, he secretly cursed the old priest. He was convinced the man had only appeared to impress the crowd. After all, House Fester was paying every expense for the entire project, while the high priest had demanded that the temple receive half of the profits from both the future hospital and the academy. Just imagining the priest's satisfied smile made it obvious how pleased he was with the arrangement. Even so, Tolan assured himself that he didn't regret accepting the deal. Gaining the high priest's support had been a necessary step if he wanted his plan to succeed. A hooded man suddenly greeted him as young master, remarking that it was good to see him again. Surprised, Tolan wondered how long Melio had been aware of his presence. Melio merely replied that the world wasn't so easily shaken and refused to explain any further. Elsewhere, a furious blonde noble slammed his fist into a stone wall, demanding to know what that old geezer was thinking and why he had suddenly decided to appear. His companion calmly explained that the acting head had simply made a clever move. If the high priest publicly supported him, the other nobles would have little choice but to follow. Grinding his teeth, the blonde noble sneered that the insignificant insect had finally decided to use his brain. He angrily declared that the future emperor of Aberon had nothing left to fear. Still consumed by rage, he stormed away, saying he needed to kill someone just to calm himself. His companion mockingly replied that there were plenty of insects nearby for him to crush instead. Later, after regaining his composure, the blonde noble stood beside a window, calmly sipping wine while quietly thinking to himself. His aide confirmed that the current acting head of House Fester was indeed Tolan Crissa, the third son of Count Crissa's family, who had faithfully served the late Duke Agony Fester as his aide for 13 years. The blonde noble slowly swirled his wine and admitted that something about the situation had been bothering him recently. Without warning, he grabbed his aide and smashed the man's head against the wall with enough force to draw blood. Looking down at him with contempt, he remarked that the aide's silent expression only irritated him even more. Blood trickled down the aide's face as he lowered his head and quietly apologized. Walking away, the noble commented that the man's refusal to scream or even flinch made him incredibly boring. Still, he admitted that this very trait was also the reason he kept him by his side. The aide simply apologized once again. The noble ordered him that if he insisted on being so dull, he should at least be useful. He instructed him to investigate 5 years of Count Crissa's tax records. If any irregularities were discovered, Count Crissa was to be arrested immediately. If no evidence could be found, they were to fabricate charges, arrest him anyway, and quietly cover everything up afterward. While kneeling among the shattered porcelain, the aide carefully gathered the broken pieces and respectfully answered, "Yes, Your Highness." Left alone once more, the prince leaned back in his chair and muttered that the first prince's condition was deteriorating much faster than expected, making the entire situation increasingly troublesome. After a brief silence, he bitterly added that the man's repeated recoveries were just as irritating as his gradual decline.